This story will tell about Duchess Alex. Born from two heroes of the empire, Zachary and Bianca Arnault did their best to ensure that their daughter received the best education in the world. And in the end, she became an indispensable person for the main character, who is the prince of the empire. The girl had to leave an heir early because she was required to participate in the war. All she gave him as a parting gift was a necklace, which always returned to her. So Alex was confident that nothing would happen to her, despite all the horrors of war. Cyril Sabran, as the prince was called, was less confident of a favorable outcome for Arnaud. But at that moment, he was still unable to confess to Alex the feelings he had been hiding for a long time. Just a few weeks later, everything changed for Sabran in the imperial palace. One of the knights brought news from the battlefield that Alex had been brutally killed in battle. The man sincerely grieved over the girl's death, but he could no longer change anything in her life. The beautiful necklace remained with the prince because there was no one to return it to. That day, Cyril was supposed to celebrate his birthday, but the holiday turned into mourning. He sincerely considered himself to be the only one to blame for the death of his beloved, whom he sent off to war. For a long time, the prince was just a false ruler on the throne for all the aristocrats. Throughout his life, he was never able to acquire a single ally because they were all killed. So Cyril became the weakest emperor in his entire reign in the empire. So he could only watch as his own servants approached him with vengeance. No one saw the boy as a ruler anymore, so they treated him ignorantly. Until the very end, Sabran did not understand that he had witnessed a real imperial coup. No one else felt sorry for the ruler, who had to be roughly thrown to the floor. The boy's crown flew off, a sad sign of the end of his reign. The biggest traitor stopped her with his foot, intending to take her for himself later. He had been plotting his revenge for years, so he was delighted by the emotion in Cyril's eyes. The man was Count Emilio of Corsica, who could not forgive the ruler for one unfortunate incident. So he prepared wine with poison in advance, so that his emperor would suffer longer before dying. No matter how much Sabran resisted, at this moment it was useless to resist the rebels. Before he died, he again remembered the beautiful face of Alex, whom he had not been able to see. A terrible pain pierced Cyril's body, but he suffered only for his lost love. With tears in his eyes, the boy thought that more than anything in the world, he wanted to protect Arnaud. In a completely different place, events, meanwhile, had not even begun to gain momentum. The cute rabbit had no idea he was being hunted until he noticed a glint from behind the trees. The creature had little intelligence, but good reflexes, so it managed to escape. And so the young girl had to watch her dinner gallop away. It was the same Alex Arnaud, but 10 years younger than the one in the story of the deceased Cyril. How did this happen, you ask? And now I will tell you in more detail what it all is about. The young lady was planning to become a knight, so she often honed her skills by hunting in the forest. But this time, her adventure ended somewhat differently due to an unexpected intervention of fate. Alex found a guy among the trees, whom she had seen for the first time in her life at that moment. This guy was our Cyril, who did not die, but was transported into the past several years. At that time, the girl often visited the former butler of her estate, named Vincent Blanchot. The old man was beloved by many because he possessed incredible wisdom and a gentle nature. It was at the very moment when he was enjoying the weather that the active Arnaud disturbed his peace. Alex couldn't contain her emotions because she found a real person in the forest. She couldn't drag it away on her own, so she returned to the house for the cart. While Cyril was unconscious, he dreamed of his own sad past. At that time, the boy often hid from the aristocrats because he could not bear the burden of rule. And only the grown-up Alex treated him with a soft smile, although he took a long time to get used to her. Sabran himself was surprised at how quickly he became attached to this strange girl. Even at that moment, Cyril felt that no one cared about his orders from the throne. The boy often cried bitterly because he was the ruler of the empire only in words. And only Arnaud always found words that could comfort her young and inexperienced charge. That time, the lady told how, as a child, she dreamed of becoming a knight, like her father. Even her mother protected the people around her, but Alex was never able to follow them. At that time, Cyril could not understand the sadness of the lady, who always appeared cheerful before him. No matter how hard it was for her, Alex always blossomed with a smile on her face, forgetting about sadness. The girl found something positive even in the saddest moments of her life. To support her ward, she gave him her necklace, which served as a talisman. This gesture was so important for a guy who was in love with a lady much older than him. But Arnaud had no idea about the ruler's feelings, since she perceived him as a brother. Therefore, the girl carelessly promised that she would definitely return for the gift she had left behind. This had always worked before, and the necklace would return to Alex, no matter who wore it. These words gave the ruler hope that not all was lost in his life. For a long time afterward, he looked at the necklace, which was left to him for some time. In her nightmares, Alex often dreamed of the prince, who wanted to quickly return her to the palace. However, the long-awaited reunification in the usual sense never happened. After all, the current Arno didn't know that the guy in front of her was a ruler who had traveled to the past. That's why the lady didn't feel anything when she saw the stranger she rescued from the forest. But for Cyril, it was a huge surprise to see such a young Alex in front of him. He instantly recognized the girl, because he had spent many hours studying every detail of her appearance. The boy jumped up in bed in surprise, despite being extremely weak. But the terrible pain in his throat and mouth prevented Sabran from saying even a word. He couldn't stop coughing for a long time after just one attempt to speak. Memories slowly rolled over the prince, who remembered his death in detail. He was sure that he had not imagined those terrible moments that had happened because of betrayal. At that moment, the Count of Corsica certainly gave the ruler a deadly poison. Therefore, our hero could not understand why he remained alive and relatively healthy. As a child, he heard a story about how, after death, it is not God at all who appears before the deceased, and the person towards whom the deceased feels guilty, and for Cyril it was Alex. But the hero's feelings told him that he was alive. Although he was not left without limitations, his forced silence made communication between them and the young lady noticeably more difficult. But Arno quickly remembered that the unknown guy could explain everything on paper. In this absurd way, communication between Alex and Cyril was still able to take place. The girl's questions seemed quite logical, so the guy answered each of them. But he was surprised that Arno did not recognize him as a prince, because he already occupied the throne. When they first met, Cyril didn't immediately realize that Alex knew nothing about him. Only after a few minutes did the hero realize that the Arno in front of him was much younger. But what scared the guy most was that the girl took her own necklace out of her pocket. Alex was sure she had given it to her father, so she didn't understand why it had returned to her. It was a real shock to Cyril when the realization suddenly came over him. No one remembered his entire past life except himself. That's why they asked questions. And this young Alex saw for the first time a guy who, by age, did not look like a prince. So now the hero had to deal with the fact that he wasn't dead at all. Instead, he was transported back in time 10 years ago, which was almost impossible. A few hours ago, Alex just dragged an unknown guy to the old man's house. Vincent still remembered well how, as a child, the lady often brought him various animals. And now he has lived to see that Arno brought him a real person on a cart. Alex simply couldn't leave a living creature in the forest, even though it could be dangerous for her. But even the butler decided that it would be a good idea to provide the boy with first aid. It was Vincent who noticed how some familiar object fell out of the hands of the unknown person. He couldn't help but tell Alex about this, because he knew that she had the same necklace. The girl immediately recognized her old gift, which she had received in childhood. And the necklace that fell from the guy's hands was exactly like the one that belonged to Alex. That is why the lady was so strict about the unknown, because she had found such a precious item. Cyril could not justify himself in this situation in any way, since he was unable to tell the truth. He would never have thought that he would fall under the suspicion of the person closest to him in the past. Alex no longer trusted the guy, even though she didn't really know his past in this life. More than anything in the world, Sabran would like to confess to the lady exactly what had happened to him. But not a single word came out of his throat, no matter how hard the guy tried to strain him. The damage followed the hero, even though he was transported through time. So young Alex never learned the incredible story of her sad future. A few minutes later, Cyril realized how desperately he had acted at that moment. It's unlikely that anyone would have believed the guy, even if he could have told the whole story. This made the prince even sadder, because there was no one else close to him in his life. Although Alex returned to the guy, their shared memories did not exist in this reality. Sad memories from his childhood still haunted Cyril, who was afraid of being alone. By the will of his cruel father, his mother had to return early to her native country without her small child. Her name was Navari, and she herself did not want everything to happen in such a cruel way. The boy only became sadder because his mother herself did not want to leave him alone. But at that moment, none of them had the right to go against the will of the ruler, who was still alive at that time. This is how the hero remained completely alone from childhood, which only made him more drawn to loved ones. For some time, the boy stubbornly did not let anyone near him, fearing separation in the future. But with the appearance of Alex in the prince's life, his everyday life almost immediately changed for the better. The girl was assigned to the ruler as a companion for his studies and games in the palace, but Cyril hadn't asked for anything like that, so he was wary of Arno's appearance. Because his mother was an envoy from another empire, many aristocrats did not trust the young prince. That's why Sabran didn't trust anyone, no matter how sincerely people around him smiled right in his face. Arno clearly didn't expect her new role to be so quickly rejected by her playmate himself, but Cyril believed that he could disappear at any moment, so he did not want to get close to anyone. Despite his young age, the heir grew up to be a wise boy, so he understood a lot. His father could die of illness at any moment, and the place of ruler would go to Cyril. However, none of the aristocrats were happy about this news, because the boy was born to Navari. They heard that the woman had remarried in her own country, and this caused even greater outrage. Only Cyril understood that his mother had no choice, since she had been forced to do something all her life. The aristocrats did not dare to tell the prince to his face that he would be better off finding a worthy replacement for himself. But all these evil words were clearly heard by Alex, who was already in the imperial palace. She tried her best to help the boy, but it was all useless at the moment. Cyril did not trust this strange noble lady, so he behaved like a cornered animal. And before the prince will finally listen to her, Arno needs to melt a lot of ice in his heart. Until then, Sabran had no intention of talking to the girl who had been assigned to him against his will, so Alex was left to silently watch as the heir drove her away time and time again. But Cyril was wrong to think that after a couple of his words, his life would return to normal. Because patient and persistent Alex began to pursue him on every mission. The girl was close to the heir and smiled at him at every opportunity. Wherever Sabran went, Arno was there, as she knew his busy schedule very well. She didn't say a word to the prince, which only made the confused boy even more tense. In the end, when one day the girl appeared right above Cyril, he still couldn't stand it. Once again, the boy was very scared because of the unexpected appearance of a girl next to him. Moreover, this time, Alex even climbed a tree in order to take a better observation post. Arno deliberately did not approach the boy first, because he said that he did not want to communicate with her. And the result of this was the anger of the prince, who could no longer tolerate the strange antics of the aristocrat. No matter how angry the heir was, he was still afraid for the health of the lady who had climbed so high. However, Alex jumped down easily and casually, right in her dress, without even losing her balance. The girl desperately tried to prove that she truly wanted to become a friend to the young heir. But the boy was not prepared to meet a person who would truly care for him. Alex became the first girl who, not just for the sake of it, wanted to help the boy everyone had forgotten about. In fact, more than anything in the world, Cyril wanted to hear that someone wanted to dispel his loneliness. So from that moment on, young Sabran became very attached to the lady, who herself did not notice her influence. But the current Alex had nothing in common with the girl whom the prince only recognized in the future. The fact that Lady Arno didn't know him made it even more painful for the hero, although he was glad that he was able to survive. However, tears still treacherously escaped from his eyes, and the guy could do nothing about it. Alex felt distrustful of the stranger, so she didn't dare to reassure him at that moment. Instead, the girl left Cyril alone with his thoughts in the hope that it would help him. However, the prince's cry touched the strings of pity in Arno's soul, so she could not help but think about his misfortune. Vincent thought the best thing to do would be to give a little time to the guy who had just happened to come to them. Alex also needed this time to think about his next plan of action. The girl didn't understand how the guy could have her necklace, since she gave it to a loved one. Her father, Zachary Arno, was supposed to return this expensive gift to his daughter upon his return home. It was for this reason that the lady could not leave Cyril alone, no matter how bitterly he cried. The girl considered herself responsible for any things that belonged to her family, so she was going to find out who the stranger was and for what purpose he appeared. But until then, the lady could not mercilessly leave the poor guy without help from her. She helped Vincent carefully put the young man to bed, who pretended to have lost his memory. Cyril felt so bad that he could not resist anything around him. But even in this state, he was struck by how poor the old man's conditions were. Since he was previously the heir, the corridor in the palace alone was the size of this room. But now, no one in life would recognize the hero as a prince, so he had to obey. Alex was worried about the old man, next to whom this strange guy remained, so she immediately warned him that she would not forgive him if something happened to Blanchot. Although Sabrain's plans actually did not involve harm to other people, Miss did not believe him. However, Det forced the girl to return to the estate, while Cyril remained with Vincent. The guy himself understood perfectly well that the suspicions directed at him were quite natural. After all, he was in such a terrible state that he couldn't even speak normally to people. Therefore, there was no way in which the young man could justify himself in this situation. First, the prince should get well, and only then think about how to become friends with Alex. It wasn't hard for the boy to guess that the current Cyril was only 5 years old. It was the saddest time for the heir, because he was left all alone in the huge palace. The father paid no attention to the heir, and his mother had just been driven out of the palace to her homeland. So the boy had some hard days ahead of him, and he wasn't even used to falling asleep on his own. Unlike that child, the adult Cyril was not so attached to the human warmth in bed. Besides, he was somewhat consoled by the fact that Alex was alive in this reality, because this was what hurt the hero the most. No matter how cruelly the girl treated him, it was better than realizing her death on the battlefield. Cyril no longer needed to rule the people when he did not want to be emperor. So that night, for the first time in a long time, the heir was able to sleep soundly and sweetly in someone else's bed. Dawn came quietly to the Duchy of Arno, where life had already been in full swing on the estate since early morning. The knights still stood guard, not intending to retreat from their military duty, and the head maid of Arno's house, named Lucy, walked with a smile towards her mistress's room. The maid had served the lady since childhood, so she was very attached to Alex. Every morning she began helping her mistress in the same way so that she could meet her responsibilities well. And this time was no exception, because Alex promised Lucy that she would finally wear a dress. The assistant was eagerly awaiting this decision, as Arno always wore jackets, so she chose a dress in advance that would suit the girl's beautiful eye color. But the faithful maid's plans were not destined to come true, because Alex decided otherwise. Only after some time did the girls notice that the mistress did not even move under the blanket. This was because Lady Arno had actually been out of bed for a long time, despite it being early in the morning. The girl ran away to meet the current butler of the estate, whom she trusted as herself. His name was Adele Langdon, and he had performed his duties brilliantly since taking over from Blanchot. Alex immediately informed him of all her suspicions regarding the guy, who was clearly from another empire. She would never have confused the skin color of the neighboring country, which was common there. Arno herself could not determine exactly how rich her found boyfriend was, but Vincent was sure that his clothes clearly belonged to one of the aristocrats of their neighbors. Adele became interested in this case, which had too many unclear aspects. The only thing the man could assume was that the boy had been kidnapped by ill-wishers. Previously, Alex did not see Cyril as a victim, but rather as her possible enemy. But the butler's words explained to the lady why the boy cried so bitterly after waking up. Until now, Miss could not forget the saddened face of her new acquaintance, who was suffering from pain. Doubts that she had acted unjustly towards him immediately began to torment the girl. But Langdon quickly found words that could soothe the remorse inside Alex. She recalled that it was the lady who guarded her family home while her parents were away. So the butler did not find it strange that the lady so quickly became suspicious of the stranger. In fact, from childhood, the girl remembered who she was supposed to become in the future. But she didn't like the idea of having to share her favorite territories with some suitor. However, like any lady of aristocratic blood, Alex will have to get married sooner or later. She tried not to think about it until the very end, because she didn't want to trust her life to someone else. But now, Alex was more interested in whether the necklace she had given her father was still there. Although Cyril was under Vincent's watchful eye, the lady suspected him. The guy slept often and a lot, because he needed to gain strength for a full recovery. The former prince's sleep was only peaceful in this place, but it did not last long. Suddenly, some unknown guy addressed the hero, calling his full royal name. This man said that if Cyril continued to sleep like this, Alex would be killed again without his knowledge. The magician wasn't going to let go of the guy so easily, about whose reincarnation he knew every little detail. In his sleep, Cyril was covered in sweat from head to toe, due to the wild horror that had gripped him. He couldn't understand how this unknown person knew so well about his past, including his reincarnation. And the man demanded that the guy not sit still and find all the enemies who killed him. Only in this way can the former prince avoid the death that was prepared for him in the future. In the middle of the night, Vincent, who had gone to bed late, heard a loud knock from above. The old man hurried to the sick man's room, hoping that he was okay. And so he caught Cyril at the moment when the hero accidentally fell out of bed after sleeping. The boy could hardly breathe because of the fear he had just experienced, but there was no one nearby. The former butler would certainly not have allowed any stranger to enter the house without his permission. So Cyril was left to wonder if what he had seen was really just a dream. At that moment, his stomach let out such a loud, hungry cry that it could be heard from the street. The old man was not at all surprised that the young man was so hungry, because he slept a lot. He was ready to take care of the boy until he was finally back on his feet. Vincent's patience was practically limitless, so he treated the young man calmly. But Cyril still couldn't come to his senses after that dream, which was so reminiscent of reality. The man who came to him seemed real, as if he really was near the bed. The hero's head was constantly spinning from the huge number of thoughts inside him. The magician said that the prince had to deal with the enemy who killed his loved ones, and this meant that Alex's death was also a cold calculation by the Count of Corsica, who became a traitor. Until now, Cyril was only concerned with the restoration of his body, because he was too weak. But now the guy thought about why he was able to reincarnate at all, and what his goal was. Meanwhile, Lady Arno was hard at work honing her skills to become a knight in the future. The girl was ready to work day and night, because her dream was so desirable. She was so immersed in her studies that she didn't notice the curious glances of the knights from the side. The guys heard that Miss had to prepare for the wedding, but she continued to train. Meanwhile, they were ready for the lady to get married and become a real lady. Alex managed to captivate many with her beautiful appearance when she wore dresses. Jean and Paul still remembered how beautiful their mistress looked when she dressed up. Every time they only dreamed of the girl dressing beautifully for the event again. Just like Alex, Cyril worked hard to ensure his speedy and complete recovery. His training took place very close by, so Arno noticed the unknown guy. Despite the pain throughout his body, Sabran stubbornly continued to push the cart with provisions. He was closely looked after by the kind Vincent, who knew how to provide first aid. It was to the butler that Alex, who was curious, turned to inquire about Cyril's condition. Blanchot was pleased with the young man, who volunteered to help him, just to become stronger and more powerful. Arno could not have imagined before that her acquaintance would become so close to the old man. She saw how hard Cyril tried, and this persistence earned the lady's respect. That's why Alex was the first to approach the former prince, who didn't dare talk to the girl. But speech never returned to Sabran, no matter how hard he tried to make at least one sound. But even so, the hero was sincerely glad to see the lady with whom he had many connections in the past. However, he still could not admit that he remembered his entire life perfectly well. Therefore, Cyril was forced to pretend that his memory had left him forever after the injury. It was clear from Alex's face that she was now genuinely worried about the lost young man. If earlier the lady suspected him of lying, now she took Cyril for the victim. Suddenly, Arno noticed that her interlocutor was already quite tall. The lady's green eyes filled with curiosity as she realized this interesting detail. In fact, Cyril wanted to say a lot in response to the lady, but he controlled himself. The guy remembered that the girl herself would grow up tall, which she would be noticeably proud of. In the past, the young man eagerly awaited the moment when he could become taller than his beloved. But at that moment, the prince could only dream of seeing Alex's face. Meanwhile, he was absolutely sure that he would be able to outgrow the already tall girl. If Cyril had been older, perhaps the grown-up Alex would have paid attention to him. And now, the hero has a real chance to confess his long and deep feelings to the lady. The guy immediately blushed at the realization of this, because he was now older than Miss Arno. He quickly turned away from the girl so that she would not notice the embarrassment on his face. Luckily for the former prince, it was at this moment that the mentor began to search for his student. So Alex had to quickly get back to training, even though her conversation wasn't over. Before leaving, she managed to promise that she would soon visit her beloved former butler. Cyril looked at the lady with a sad expression, since he still hadn't been able to talk to her normally. But Alex's figurine reminded him of the incredible tenacity of this little heiress of Arno. On the way home, the hero pondered the fact that Arno was stubbornly preparing to become a knight. He remembered that in her past life, the lady had never been able to do this due to a turning point. But a lot could have changed if Alex had not given up on her cherished dream. So now, Cyril had to do everything to ensure that the lady followed the intended path. And for this, he was going to look after the kind old man who patiently looked after him. After all, it was Vincent's death that caused Alex to give up her knighthood. But these events had not yet happened, so Arno did not even think about changing her path. She fulfilled all the obligations of a knight, although Paul and Jean were ready to do everything for her. The guys sincerely didn't understand why a lady would do even the dirtiest job. However, Alex was so immersed in her work that she didn't make any excuses for herself. Her teacher Robert fully supported the girl's tactics, so he drove the lazy people away from her. The man was the only person who already treated Alex like a knight. Being a mentor to all the students, he drove Jean and Paul away from the lady with one order. Each time, Arno was incredibly grateful to Robert for his constant support of her efforts. At that moment, Cyril, who had come with Vincent today, appeared on the horizon. The lady was amazed by the persistence of the guy, who did not pay attention to the weakness of his body. Even the mentor recognized him, since he had heard a lot about the lost one from Miss. Sabran didn't pay attention to the people around him, as he was focused on his body, but Alex could see that he was getting much better than before. But it wasn't clear from Cyril's perspective that he was actually gradually improving. Despite all of Vincent's efforts, the hero periodically began to feel very nauseous again. But now, Alex was sure that the young man did not pose any danger to her. She admitted that she had previously thought he was a spy, which Paul and Jean overheard by chance. But to test her theory, the lady escaped from the estate late at night, when everyone was already asleep. She headed to the old man's house to find out what Cyril was doing at such an hour. And what Alex saw forever changed her opinion of the boy lost in the forest. The lady couldn't believe that the guy would cry even in his sleep because of his situation. No spy could have done such a thing. So the miss finally believed this young man. No matter how many times the lady came to Cyril at night, he suffered from nightmares every time. Miss refused to think that all these tears were actually part of the acting. The wise girl's words convinced the mentor that he didn't have to worry for now. Besides, Alex was eagerly awaiting her father's response regarding her rare necklace. Robert didn't expect that his ward would think through all the details so carefully just to justify Cyril. He was pleased with how noble Arno had grown up to be, and that she would manage the estate in the future. So the man had no doubt that the lady would make a good knight. The girl was moved to tears by the words of her mentor, who rarely complimented anyone. She remembered very well the rise of her father as a knight, who was under the supervision of Vincent. There was a time when the estate remained solely under Robert's protection, as his father had gone off to war, and only Blanchot supported the young Bianca, who was pregnant with little Alex at that time. So the former butler was perceived as part of the Arno family, even though he was not a relative. The hero remembered as if it were yesterday that day, when he and Alex played with stones on the water. He wasn't very good at creating circles, but the boy still didn't despair. It was then that Cyril first discovered the truth, that Arno also had a sad past. The girl blamed herself for Vincent's death, because she was there at that moment, but was unable to help. Until now, sadness overcame the lady whenever she remembered the old man's sad death. Then the boy could only silently listen to the confessions of the lady with whom he was madly in love. Alex herself prayed only that next time she would have enough strength. That was why Cyril was now doing everything he could to make sure the old man was okay. Although Vincent remained an intelligent and understanding man, the moments of old age overtook him too. And this time, Blanchot could not find the glasses until the young man pointed them out to him. Sabran treated such jokes from the butler, whom he liked, with politeness. As usual, the old man had too much to do to remain quietly in the house. He didn't expect the lost boy to follow him, as he had previously coped alone. But Cyril was too afraid that something would happen to his grandfather without him. So this time, the hero went after the old man to save him in time of danger. Vincent had nothing against the company of the young man, who constantly made his life easier. Sabran didn't tell anyone about the experiences that tormented his head. He didn't know exactly what incident had ultimately led to the death of his beloved butler. That's why the boy always tried to accompany the old man in order to save him at the right moment. But this time, something else captured the attention of the young man, who adored the young lady Alex. Along the way, they saw how bravely Miss trained in horse riding to become a knight. At such moments, the girl looked free and full of life, although she herself did not notice it. But Cyril could clearly see the difference, because he knew the older Alex. Therefore, the guy wanted to do everything possible to keep that smile on the lady's face. Although Sabran hardly moved from his place, the number of important tasks in his life kept increasing. The young man left with the old man, and therefore did not notice the suspicious glances on the field. Paul and Jean exchanged glances, as they had long wanted to talk to that guy. They silently agreed to follow him to interrogate him at the first opportunity. But Cyril found himself drawn into the very center of the conversation, because Vincent was popular. Blanchot answered even the strangest questions with a kind smile, helping the townspeople. Soon the hero became so tired that he sat down a little to the side, watching the understanding old man. He didn't immediately understand why the former butler was in such demand among people. But, watching from the sidelines, the boy realized that Blanchot was a grandfather to everyone around him. Cyril watched with white envy as the townspeople sincerely reached out to the common man. They trusted not only Vincent, but also the entire Arnaud family, to which he had belonged for a long time. The former prince couldn't help but think about what would happen if he had such a person. Even now, the young man remained alone most of the time, because he did not know how to make friends. Sebran could never dream of becoming a ruler whom the people would trust. At that moment, when the guy relaxed, knights suddenly approached him from behind. No one in the crowd noticed that the dark-skinned young man was forcibly taken aside by two people. So the hero finds himself in a situation from which he will have to get out completely on his own. Paul and Jean were serious and were not going to let the stranger go so easily. They believed that he was a spy and wanted to uncover the whole truth about Cyril's past. But the guy had no idea that such rumors were circulating about him among the knights of the Arnaud family. The knights were convinced that another country had sent Sebran to them to gather information. So they tried to get answers from the silent young man they suspected. Previously, the hero had not even thought about the fact that in a strange place, even the color of his eyes could confuse other people. So now the former prince had to fight against the knights of the Duchy of Arnaud. But not far away, Vincent, for whom the heir was worried, was left unattended. Therefore, the guy could not hesitate, because at any moment Blanchot could accidentally die. He used all his strength just to break past the skilled and strong knights. Jean did not expect such speed from a young man who could barely walk only recently. But now Cyril bit his opponent painfully, so that he would loosen his grip and let him go. Only this helped the young man escape from the hands of the knights, who did not foresee such a strong rebuff. But with his actions, Sebran aroused even more suspicion among Arnaud's loyal knights. He couldn't explain anything, because he was unable to speak, and no one would believe him anyway. So for Cyril, the only salvation was flight. But this time too, it ended in failure. Paul pinned the foreigner firmly to the ground, so that he could not harm any of them again. Tears of bitterness gushed from Sebran's eyes, as he could not come to terms with his helplessness. The deadly situation, just like in his past life, was repeated again, and the guy could do nothing. Jean was so angry that he was ready to harm an enemy from another country. And at that moment, nothing stopped the knight from harming the newly recovered Cyril. The knight saw the guy as a spy, so he didn't feel even a drop of pity or sympathy for him. But at the very last moment, Robert still managed to block his student's blow. The mentor was furious that his charges were doing something crazy in the middle of the day. He taught them that they shouldn't point weapons at the weak, but the boys didn't listen. Neither Jean nor Paul expected that their small undertaking would be discovered so quickly by their elders. More than anything in the world, they were afraid of disappointing their beloved mentor, who was strict. The boys were deeply offended by the fact that Robert deservedly called them real street thugs. Cyril couldn't believe his eyes when the ashamed knights immediately released him. The guy suffered mentally much more than physically, which affected his condition. Jean and Paul quickly ran away, just to avoid further anger from the usually calm mentor. Although Sebran felt that the danger had passed, he could not calm down within himself. The young man understood perfectly well that he was simply lucky that Robert was nearby at the right moment. He didn't think he was strong enough to repel this attack on his own. Therefore, Cyril was sincerely grateful to the mentor, who accidentally managed to come to his aid. As soon as Robert left on business, the hero immediately plunged into dark thoughts about what had just happened. After all, the former prince couldn't escape even from two people, so how could he resist stronger enemies? The guy didn't even suspect that the mentor didn't just leave this situation alone when he came to Alex with it. No matter how much the man wanted to disgrace his subordinates, he did not want to hide the truth from the girl. At first, Lady Arnaud greeted the teacher joyfully, as she did not immediately notice his serious face. But as soon as the man told about the situation with Cyril, Mrs. Goodmood immediately evaporated. It wasn't hard for her to guess that it was her words about the spy that had harmed the poor guy. When the lady came to her grandfather at night to ask Cyril for forgiveness, he was already asleep. Alex didn't dare wake the young man, although she had been tormented by serious pangs of conscience for several hours. Vincent immediately noticed that his mistress could not get some thought out of her head. The girl felt ashamed that her words had caused an attack on Cyril, who had already suffered. When the lady made her assumptions, She had no intention of testing them in this way. Neither the old man nor the girl knew that at that moment, Sebron was still awake and could clearly hear their conversation outside the door. But the guy didn't even think of blaming Alex for anything, because he himself couldn't give a worthy rebuff to his offenders. The worst thing for him was that the next morning, Lady Arno made a decision that surprised everyone. The girl couldn't allow Cyril to get hurt again, so she was going to go everywhere with him. And everything would have been fine if the hero hadn't remembered that something unpleasant could have happened to the old man. Sebron was afraid that Alex might now be accidentally drawn into the situation that led to Vincent's death. So from now on, the guy had to watch not only the old man, but also the restless lady. After all, Alex also planned to help her grandfather with his business during her forced break from training. And this time, Blanchot took on an unusual task for himself as he decided to inspect the flooded river. The dam was barely able to withstand the influx of water due to the enormous amount of rainfall recently. This greatly worried the residents, so Vincent went to check early in the morning. The old man immediately noticed that almost all the ground near the water was soaked due to the constant splashes in the area. Even Cyril could see how turbulent and powerful this usually calm river flow was. Due to carelessness, the guy accidentally slipped, which was dangerous to do right next to the water. But Alex was close enough to catch the young man before he could fall into the river. Only through her trained knightly reflexes did Arno prevent this fall. But what happened next could not have been predicted by any of the people who were now examining the dam. Vincent slipped after Cyril, but no one managed to save him from falling into the cold river. In an instant, the hero realized that this very event would lead to the death of the kind and wise old man. He himself was surprised at where he got the strength to save Vincent, who quickly went underwater. At that moment, the young man did not hesitate for a second, because the old man's life depended entirely on it. So he took a running leap into the water to save Vincent, who would never have made it through the current on his own. Alex could only scream and cry loudly for the friends she couldn't see on the surface. The girl was too scared to jump into the icy water after the boy and the old man. Cyril's consciousness was clouded by the cold as soon as he entered the seething water. He forgot who he once was and who he is now, because all thoughts were driven out by pressure from all sides. But suddenly, a memory descended upon the hero that Arno had never shared with him. It was exactly the same situation in the past, when the girl came to the dam with her former butler. Then, it was the lady who first slipped on the shore and fell painfully to the ground, as no one caught her. Alex was used to pain, so she didn't really pay attention to this little incident. She immediately showed Vincent that she was okay, despite the unexpected fall. It was at this very moment that the situation occurred that led to tragedy in the hearts of many. Blanchot himself tripped and fell into the water, which could only have meant death for the frail old man at the end of his years. But the horror of the past paralyzed the girl, so she was unable to jump after her beloved. Therefore, Blanchot's death became inevitable, and Alex came to the place of his death every year. Previously, Cyril did not understand the meaning of his adult friend's words, but now everything became clear to him. She began to consider herself unworthy of knighthood after this incident, but the guy could not allow the lady to give up. He desperately tried to grab hold of the only person whose salvation would allow Miss to be a knight. Vincent lost consciousness almost immediately after falling into the water, as it was an impossible test for him. So everything else fell to young Sebron, who not long ago could barely save himself. But no matter how strong the water cycle was, the young man held tightly to the old man, to whom he had become attached. It was only pure chance that night that allowed both Cyril and Vincent to survive this incident. The young girl walked across the bridge, hoping that the walk would lull her little sister to sleep. But the little girl had no intention of sleeping, because she noticed something interesting in the water at the very bottom of the bridge. The girl immediately reported that she had seen her grandfather, although her sister did not believe her strange words. But the girl was used to respecting any age, so she still carefully approached the edge of the bridge. She held her little sister tightly so that she wouldn't accidentally jump into the water out of curiosity and stupidity. At first, the lady could see nothing through the turbulent water and the darkness of the night that covered the entire city. When Mrs. Eyes adjusted, she discovered below her two silhouettes of people who needed help. The girl had never encountered such a situation before, as people usually did not go near the water. Her loud and clear voice instantly woke up the townspeople in the area, calling for help for these two. It was only thanks to this chance that Cyril and Vincent were saved with minimal damage. The hero woke up only a few days later and found himself in a warm and soft bed. He immediately noticed that his right hand had been carefully treated due to a compound fracture. It turned out that due to severe anxiety, Alex had been near the patient's bed the entire time. The girl immediately told the guy that, thanks to his courage, everything was already fine with Vincent. The old man was already strolling around the city again, although he did not dare approach the dam. This news pleased the former prince, as it meant that he had fulfilled his duties. So the guy smiled happily at the lady, as far as his mouth could stretch into a smile. But young Arno was in no mood for fun, because all this time she suffered from a deep sense of guilt. Sabran did not expect that he could not rid his beloved of all the doubts inside her kind and caring soul. In her emotions, Alex even yelled at the guy, although she understood perfectly well that he was not guilty of anything. But the relief that Cyril was okay washed over the girl, and she could no longer hold back. In fact, Arno was terrified that she might lose either Vincent or Cyril. The girl always seemed so strong to the former prince that he forgot how sensitive she was. And now all of Sebran's desires were focused on how he could console the lady who was crying so sadly. Alex would never have forgotten Cyril if he had died in the water instead of her beloved butler. And only now this truth was revealed to the hero, and yet he was ready to sacrifice himself. The guy didn't want the lady to suffer because of him, because he only wanted the best for her. But he still couldn't say a word, so he had to just silently wipe the tears from the lady's face. Alex spoke first, because she had something to tell her new friend, whom the lady had previously considered a traitor. For some reason, the girl remembered her necklace, which had been brought back from another country in her childhood. Before her father left, she gave him this gift in the hope that the man would return home. Alex never talked about it, but she loved her dad very much and tried to look up to him in everything. That is why, after Zachary's departure, the lady began to train so diligently for knighthood. And now the girl was able to clarify one point that concerned her necklace with Cyril. A letter arrived from the Duke saying that the necklace was still in his possession. Cyril didn't expect the lady to conduct such a serious check regarding her favorite necklace. But now the girl was completely sure that she had simply mixed up the pendants because of their similarity. She returned the necklace to the young man because she believed that it could belong only to him. The guy could not admit that the sensations had not actually deceived young Alex. From now on, Lady Arno was going to trust everything to the unknown person who saved her beloved butler. This is how the hero gained the trust of the girl for whom he had feelings, although he did not expect it. Alex wanted to hear words of forgiveness for not having trusted her friend before. She would have suffered from remorse for a long time if the guy had not accepted her words. In fact, Cyril believed that he had no right to appropriate what belonged to Arno, but it was impossible to explain this, so the young man only nodded, acknowledging the peace between them. The lady breathed a sigh of relief when she realized that Cyril did not hold her responsible for her cruel behavior. Miss remembered that the guy hadn't come to for 4 days, so he was probably hungry. But before eating, she suggested that he wash himself so that Sabran would feel better. The hero did not expect that the lady would remember even such nuances to which he did not pay attention. The young man blushed from head to toe when Alex herself offered to help him wash himself. It seemed strange to him that a girl would help him take a shower. So, although Arno acted naturally, Cyril could not get rid of his embarrassment. Soon the lady left for a short time, leaving the guy to undress on his own. But even so, calm did not return to Sabran, who was too embarrassed. He couldn't believe that Alex would take part in washing him, although he had always been helped before. With difficulty, the young man was able to come to terms with what awaited him during this strange dump. Because of his sore arm, he took much longer to take off his clothes than he normally could. But even all these routine actions did not distract Cyril from his main thoughts about the shower. So he jumped with excitement when he heard the front door open. The redness of the young man's face betrayed his extreme embarrassment and excitement at what lay ahead. But it wasn't Alex who came to the guy's aid, because she called Robert. Cyril didn't expect at all that the lady would be much smarter than him in such little things. On the one hand, the hero was upset, but at least he got rid of the unclear situation with Miss. Sabran only now realized that Arno could not have helped him in the first place because of her status. Seeing the boy's strange state, the mentor suggested that he not wash himself in order to rest. But Cyril remembered Alex's words about him lying in bed for 4 whole days. More than anything in the world, the young man was afraid that he might smell bad next to Alex. So he confidently demanded that Robert help him with the soaping procedures. The former prince was not shy about showing his body to a man, because there was nothing wrong with it. Robert looked at the boy carefully and noticed that he was used to help with washing. Moreover, his entire body was covered in muscles, which indicated long-term training in fencing. The mentor was deeply grateful to this young man for not being afraid to jump into the water. He honestly told Cyril about this, who saved Alex from having to sacrifice himself. At that moment, the girl ran to Robert's aid. As she herself did not dare to do anything, she was in tears because of the fear and panic that was tearing her soul apart. So, if it weren't for Cyril, something bad could have happened to Lady Arno. However, Robert asked the guy not to do that again, because he also needed to have a family. But the hero knew perfectly well that no one tried to look for him in this reality. In the past, his only close relative was Empress Olivia, who died early. So, the lonely adult Cyril had no one to worry about his death. At that moment, the city was conducting an investigation into how the people ended up in the river. Butler Langdon personally handled the matter to ensure no detail was missed. They quickly found a young witness for him, who noticed the two men in the water. The girl recounted in detail the day when Cyril and Vincent were barely saved. Only thanks to a net stretched near the bridge were the two able to survive in the cold river. But this network wasn't always located under the bridge, so the men were just lucky. Usually, residents always put it up during floods, since sheep often fell into the water, and only with the help of a net could they be pulled out of the fast-flowing river without any problems. Suddenly, the girl remembered that they were already saving a second person with the help of this net. This news came as a surprise to Langdon, who had never heard of such a thing before. But it turned out that many years ago, another person fell into these nets and then left with the pilgrim. The butler froze in horror as he guessed exactly which person was being talked about. He couldn't even imagine that the evil kidnapper Alex would still turn out to be alive and well. But all the people of the Arno family had considered him dead for many years, since they could not find him. But it turned out that at that moment, the life of the failed kidnapper was not over at all. The hero had no idea that his actions had led to the revelation of a long-standing secret. He simply lived among people who had come to sincerely love him for his character and soul. And Cyril himself became no less attached to his surroundings, wishing happiness for his loved ones. For the first time in a long time, the boy felt as if he was among a real family. And Alex was happy to see that day by day, the young man was gradually recovering under supervision. But the happy and carefree days were not destined to last long, because someone came. This man immediately went to Alex, because they had long had scores to settle with each other. The girl didn't expect that a man would find her so easily in a quiet and peaceful village. His name was Pierre Gallion, and he challenged Arno to a duel as soon as he saw her after a long time. The lady froze for a moment in front of her opponent, who was clearly many times stronger than her. There was not a shadow of doubt on the man's face when he proposed a duel to the girl, and Alex understood perfectly well that she had no way to refuse. This was all because the knight was serious and rarely joked about such topics. So he was the first to prepare for battle, although its outcome was obvious from the very beginning. At that moment, Cyril just came out into the courtyard and was able to see what was happening nearby. The battle between Pierre and Alex had just begun, and the man had not yet applied full force. However, the hero could not allow the lady to suffer in a fight with a powerful unknown. So far, Arno managed to dodge the blows, although it was becoming increasingly difficult for her. Gallion showed no compassion, despite the obvious difference in strength and skill. But the girl did not retreat, although she herself understood how stupid her resistance was. Every time Miss thought she was going to win, Pierre managed to get her, so Alex had to retreat again, even though the battle could have just ended. But she had no intention of giving up, because that was the whole point of hard battles. Neither of the two expected that another person would suddenly join their battle. Cyril confidently jumped straight at the evil man, swinging his arm well. Although Pierre saw the attack perfectly well, he was so surprised that he did not manage to block the blow. Sabran ended up hitting the stranger right on the head in the hopes that it would disarm him. But Alex wasn't happy about this, because in reality there was no danger for her, and not even because Gallion was actually out of action at the moment. However, Cyril did not notice the girl's emotions, as he was focused on the battle. He did not stop at one blow, wanting to finally defeat the strong opponent. Imagine the hero's surprise when Arno ran as fast as she could towards her former enemy. In fact, the lady knew this man very well, because they had been close since childhood. But no one had time to tell about this Cyril, and that's why he found himself in such an awkward situation. Luckily, Pierre didn't even think of getting angry at the guy who had just attacked him so confidently. Only now did Alex introduce the friends to each other, explaining that Gallion was her bodyguard. She herself did not expect that her dark-skinned friend would react so violently to some stranger. The young man realized his mistake too late, so he could only look sadly at Pierre. However, Gallio was wise enough to understand that the boy did not do this out of malice. The knight's manner of communication with Alex could indeed seem quite dangerous from the outside. Therefore, as soon as the man stood up, he approached the foreigner in a friendly manner. Pierre affectionately patted him on the head as a sign of praise, because the young man had done everything correctly. Gallion would like Alex to always be surrounded by such selfless guys. Although many things were surprising to Cyril, Pierre already considered him almost his friend. At this point, the knight's greeting ended, for he still had much to do at the estate. As soon as he left, Alex apologized for her friend's behavior, which frightened Cyril. She just now explained that Pierre had always been like an older brother to her in fencing. Lady Arno heard that the man was forced to return from the battle due to injuries sustained. Then the girl remembered that the guy also had problems with his hand, and he was gesturing so actively to her. Alex was sincerely worried about the young man's condition, because he was injured because of her. Cyril felt better just seeing the sympathy that was visible on the face of the beautiful Lady Arno. That's why he often forgot about the pain, because intimacy with the girl was much more important to him. And this time, the guy hinted that everything was fine with him, because he had enough strength and toughness. With the help of a letter on his hand, the hero clarified whether he had really interfered in something that was none of his business. But Alex didn't take Cyril's random support as any kind of stupidity, so she reminded him that the guy genuinely believed that she needed help at that moment. The lady admitted that she had another close friend who often helped her in battles, and now she felt as if Gaston was present next to her again. Seeing the girl's joyful smile, the hero no longer worried that he had done something wrong. For the first time since his rebirth, Cyril was able to smile so cheerfully at Alex, and this struck the lady, who rarely saw bright emotions on the face of the usually calm guy. Most of the time, the hero was so immersed in heavy thoughts that he hardly smiled. So, in the heat of the moment, Arno admitted that the young man was like another older brother to her. Miss couldn't resist and stroked the guy on the head, just as Pierre had done not long ago. But what hurt Zebra the most was that Alex didn't see him as a potential partner. However, he did not confess to the girl his feelings, for which there was no place now. Alex devoted all her free time to training to become a knight, and the guy supported her. But even this now seemed insufficient to the eternally anxious hero who had accidentally been reborn. The young man understood that much in the future depended on how much effort he would put in. The hero's intuition told him that nothing bad should happen to Vincent anymore, so now there was no need to worry that their small detachment would soon split up. But the worry that there were still enemies somewhere did not give Cyril the opportunity to calm down. So the guy made the only right decision that could help Alex. That night, he did not go to bed, as he always did, in order to better recover from his injuries. Instead, Cyril went to visit Robert, who had stayed late in the work tent. The determination in the boy's eyes told the mentor that he had made an important decision. And indeed, from that moment on, Cebron wanted to train again to protect Arno. That evening, Alex had to deal with the difficulties that the maids presented. Lucy remembered that the lady didn't have training tomorrow, so she wanted to dress her up in a dress. The assistant was already tired of the fact that the disobedient mistress always ran away at the right moment. Of course, the maid had no intention of giving up on her mistress, since she was trying only for her sake. So, with the best of intentions, she suggested that the girl start growing her hair. After all, Alex will soon have to think about an engagement to some aristocrat. No matter how much Arno resisted it, she could not go against her family's customs. Only Cyril knew that in the past, the girl had become engaged immediately after coming of age. While looking after Vincent, the hero would also like a better life for his beloved. It was after the old man's death that Alex quickly gave up on her dream of becoming a knight. But now, events were already taking a slightly different course, which could not but please Cebron. He still cared deeply about Blanchoc, who was so important to many people. In fact, the guy didn't just wait for the old man to completely fall asleep. After all, now every night he came to the estate in order to learn how to shoot. When he first came to Robert, he was surprised to meet the young man at such a late hour. The man was not used to worrying right away, so he remained calm even now. Cyril decided to trust his mentor for a reason, because he was able to remember something about him. He did not immediately recognize this man, because in his past life, they had never had the opportunity to communicate in person. But Robert's face immediately seemed familiar to Cebron, so that he was sure that he had seen him before. Only a few days later did the guy realize exactly when he had met the man. It was he who, with tears in his eyes, brought the news that Alex had died on the battlefield. So Cyril had no doubt that Robert would never betray him. After all, even in her past life, the mentor followed the young Lady Arno until the very end. At this time, the rotten plans of one of the prince's enemies had already begun to come into action. Count Corsica came to Lady Bianca, who was forced to stay outside the house early in the morning. Emilio wanted to make sure that the agreement regarding his son's marriage to Alex was still in force. Even Madame Arno's assistants didn't like him, but they all silently tolerated his presence. No matter what impudence the aristocrat spoke, the servants had no right to interfere in the conversation. The count took full advantage of his impunity, since he was in a better position at that moment. The Duchess had little to say in response to her interlocutor, whose alliance was beneficial to her. But Corsica was wrong if he thought that Bianca would not be able to choose her words carefully in response. The woman wisely reminded that it was now much more important to maintain peace in the empire. Zachary Arno tried his best to bring victory to this war, which had dragged on for a long time, and so his wife asked for help from other aristocrats to raise more troops. But the count managed to stay away each time, and now he again spoke of neutrality. He angrily reminded them that the Arno family's history was not long enough to warrant respect. That is why Corsica wanted to unite with a young family that had many heroes. Bianca found herself at a dead end again, as she didn't have such good arguments in response, and the count put pressure on the woman, demanding that the engagement between their children be carried out as soon as possible. He had so much power behind him that Madame could not refuse this man without consequences. However, Bianca once again managed to come up with a way out of this difficult situation. She suggested with a smile that they should first let the children meet each other before the engagement. The Duchess had no doubt that her daughter would give a good reception to the guests. This time, Emilio couldn't refuse, because he needed to maintain good relations. The meeting was soon over, and Bianca hurried back to her important business. But the assistants could not remain silent about the fact that the Count was only constantly intimidating the Duchess. The man was even ready to gently beat Corsica so that no one would know about it. But Bianca understood perfectly well that this would not help her get rid of Emilio's tenacious hands. However, the situation was such that the Arno family no longer had any allies among their neighbors. That is why they needed help from Corsica so much, as it was an ancient family. All her life, the Duchess tried to avoid such a sad fate for her daughter, so she wasn't going to give up so easily on the path to finding salvation for her husband. And to begin with, Bianca planned for Alex to show herself in all her glory in front of important guests. For several days, the entire Arno estate was preparing to welcome important guests. Alex did not immediately learn of the arrival of the Count of Corsica and his son, since the letter was late, but she immediately reported this to the butler, because she herself would not have been able to cope with the meeting. The girl was still not sure whether she wanted this marriage or whether she was listening to her parents. The Duchess wanted her daughter to demonstrate her full competence, but this raised questions among the ladies. She was far from the usual aristocrats, who twirled gaily in their dresses in front of their guests. Langdon could see how difficult it was for the young lady to make such important decisions in her life. Several months ago, the parents planned a trip for their daughter to the Corsican lands. And then Alex was against it. Although she couldn't say anything in response to her beloved mom and dad, she did not relish the opportunity to get to know her future husband from a noble family better. Luckily for the lady, the trip was cancelled because her father had to leave for the war. So Alex was left alone in the estate, confused, even though she had never had plans cancelled before. And the skilled butler could not ease the sorrow of the miss, who was completely lost. He knew that plans had changed because of the war that had suddenly broken out in the Arno territory. Langdon had his own interpretation of the meaning of the letter from the wise Duchess, who was currently absent. The girl felt better when the man advised her not to try to be another person. She still felt her mad passion for chivalry, just like several years ago. Even then, the lady worked hard every day to hone her skills in order to stand next to her father. Alex didn't think about being a lady because she had other dreams at that moment. And Zachary encouraged any of his daughter's desires, even if they were far from ordinary femininity. It was important to the man that the girl grew up happy, no matter what role she chose for herself. So every now and then, he reminded Alex how much he and her mother loved their daughter. With her father's support, the girl blossomed every time because she felt loved. She was even more determined to prove that she was worthy of ruling the duchy in the near future. But in reality, the Duke hoped that his daughter's path would not be full of cruelty and bloodshed. He knew better than anyone how terrible it was to see the deaths of close comrades in battle. So Zachary tried his best to make sure Alex didn't suffer his fate on the path to chivalry. However, nightmares caused by worries about her father still often tormented Lady Arno. She could hardly breathe after such dreams that were full of horror and pain from the death of people. Alex jumped up in bed in a panic that night, only realizing after a while that everything was fine. Out of habit, she reached for the amulet that had been hanging around her neck since childhood. But now the beautiful necklace protected Zachary, so nothing could console the girl. Alex didn't have to get up early this morning because all training was temporarily canceled. However, after such a terrible awakening, the lady was still unable to fall asleep. She remembered well the words of the grumpy maid who promised to dress her in a dress early in the morning. But the girl herself would have preferred the regular military uniform she wore every day. With these thoughts, Alex finally lost the rest of her sleep. Despite it being early in the morning, having nothing better to do, Arno decided to take a walk around the area, since some people were already awake. But she didn't expect to meet the hard-working Cyril at the training ground. The guy was so focused on his task that he didn't notice the arrival of his girlfriend, and she immediately headed towards Robert, who was closely watching the training from afar. The man calmly explained that the young man himself had expressed a desire to learn fencing and shooting. Since Cyril's arm was still healing from the fracture, the mentor gave him only a bow. He knew that shooting would allow the boy to recover faster due to the hard training. And the results were already noticeable, because the hero controlled his injured hand much more freely. Robert couldn't help but praise the guy, who had probably already studied fencing before. This came as a surprise to Alex, as the young man seemed frail and weak in appearance. The mentor noticed that the lady was sincerely worried about the condition of Cyril, who worked a lot. So he conveyed the words of the hard-working young man that he would now protect Miss. The girl was pleased to hear that another loyal protector had appeared in her circle. Robert himself understood perfectly well that Cyril was now working on the verge of fainting due to overtime. However, the man respected the boy's decision and advised Alex to do the same. Alex knew better than anyone how good a mentor her favorite fencing teacher was, so it was no surprise that Cyril had a hard time during his studies. However, the young man did not give up after the first difficulties, persistently striving towards his goal. Only through hard work could the hero gain the opportunity to save Alex in the future. It was only when the sun began to rise that the boy noticed that he had already been in the field for many hours. To prevent Cyril from actually fainting, Robert sent him back to Vincent. But Sabran hadn't managed to go far before he noticed those same Jean and Paul on his way. The knights had just come out for training and were too sleepy to notice Cyril. But the hero didn't want to check whether they had changed their attitude towards him after the last time. It was at this very moment, when the boy was too confused, that salvation came to him unexpectedly. Alex managed to change clothes and return to the field, so she noticed the fear in her good friend's eyes. She quickly hid Cyril so that Jean and Paul could not see their presence nearby. The girl herself did not pay attention to their closeness during hide-and-seek, but the guy felt it. The young man could not hide his face, which was becoming redder and redder with every passing second from embarrassment. He tried to remind himself that the lady already had a fiancé, but it didn't help much at the moment. Even the fact that Alex perceived Cyril as a brother did not stop him from sincerely loving her. For a moment, the former prince remembered the same adult Arno who often helped him in the palace. Even then, the guy appreciated the girl who so unexpectedly appeared in his life on command. And in the current reality, the lady also sought to help Cyril, who had done a lot for her. She believed that Jean and Paul were good guys, but it was better not to meet them now. That's why Alex invited the guy to go for a walk with her for a while. Soon the girl brought the young man to the estate, where she had many good acquaintances. One of them was Langdon's daughter, Yvette, who served in this place. Alex hoped that the girl would quickly accept her friend, who had already saved the girl more than once. Cyril had no idea that Lady Arno had introduced him to the little lady for a reason. The whole thing was that Alex asked the girl to look after the guy who was sleeping poorly. It was important to the Duke's daughter that Cyril did not overexert himself during his nightly training. Cyril did not expect that the lady would become aware of even such details of his life. He wasn't ready to admit to the girl how much effort he put into his efforts. Since his rebirth, Sabran has kept everything to himself because he believed it was the right thing to do. But Alex was unconsciously trying to bring peace of mind to a guy she didn't trust at first, and her support was extremely valuable to the young man, who did not dare admit it to the lady. From that moment on, many things began to change in Cyril's life, even without his consent or knowledge. So, the guy got his first friend in a while, although he himself had not planned anything like that. Lady Arno left her friends, but only so that they could get along with each other. Yvette turned out to be a surprisingly smart and observant girl, which was unexpected. She immediately noticed that the guy was not afraid to touch Alex, despite the opposite gender. These words confused Cyril, who did not want to confess his feelings to anyone. He hurried to quicken his pace, just so that the girl wouldn't notice any more details on his face. The young man realized that he had to be much more careful if he did not want to be discovered. The appearance of that unknown man forced the guy to hurry in, carrying out his plans. He didn't want to experience again that wild horror that the magician with cold hands had brought upon him. Only the memories of the beautiful Alex kept Sabran calm. But Yvette looked as if she knew about the guy's feelings for her young and beautiful mistress. So Cyril's acquaintance with this girl did not go well from the very beginning, due to his embarrassment. However, the guy did not forget about his main plan, which he was going to implement. In their past lives, neither he nor Alex had enough influence or power. That is why, even as the heir, Cyril could not object to the Count of Corsica. The man was the first to speak of sending Lady Arno to war as support, and only Sabran tried to reject this proposal, but no one listened to him. All the prince's objections flew past the ears of the cunning and deceitful Count Emilio Corsica. The boy realized too late that he had accidentally fallen into the aristocrat's insidious trap. The man cited Saint Daniela as an example, who bravely waged war in a neighboring state. He reminded that Alex was the daughter of Saint Bianca, so she had many chances in battle. Corsica planned to make Lady Arno a real heroine after winning the battle, but the Count knew very well that Miss would never survive that brutal battle. However, the people foolishly agreed with the clever Corsica, since they respected him many times more than the prince. Already at that moment, Emilio was cunningly leading the aristocrats right in front of the prince's face, and Cyril could not find the words to respond to the Count's ironclad arguments. All the people around supported the man who was sending his relative to war. Only Sabran feared that God might turn away from the supposed saint Alex had been made into. Now, the hero wondered whether his future would have changed if he had stopped the Count, or else this treacherous man would have found a way to seize the throne anyway. In this reality, it was clear to Cyril that he only had some strange magician on his side. It was he who told the guy that his opponents from his past life had already begun their actions, and the young man rightly considered the Count, who had ruined his past life, to be one of his main enemies. At the expense of other people, Corsica eventually achieved his goals, and no one could stop him. But in this life, Cyril had no intention of allowing Emilio to celebrate victory again. At the first opportunity, the guy wanted to kill the Count, who had caused him a lot of pain. The hero had no doubt that it was precisely because of Corsica's plan that he suffered such a fate. What hurt Cyril most was that Alex also found herself involved in the Count's cruel dealings, so the young man trained every day and night, just to become stronger than his opponent. His efforts were quickly rewarded with success, so that his arrows increasingly hit the target. The guy himself was pleased with the results, but he still judged himself too harshly. So even Robert had to stop the hard-working student from overdoing it. Cyril was not used to arguing with the teacher. No matter how much he wanted to continue his studies, usually they trained until dawn, but this time the night was still deep. The mentor explained this by the change of seasons, during which the sun shone less and less during the day. The man was patient with the fact that Cyril might not know some of the nuances of life here, and the hero felt sincere gratitude to Robert, who told him about everything. For some time, the mentor will not be able to teach the student, which he honestly admitted to him, but Cyril was eager to train near home, just to keep up the pace of his training. The guy was so deep in thought that he didn't even ask what kind of guests would be coming to the estate. He returned home only at dawn, since he was still personally engaged near the village. Vincent quickly returned to the conversation after the greeting, as he was interested in the conversation. This is how Cyril was able to find out that it was the Count of Corsica who was supposed to arrive soon. The young man could not have imagined that he would have the chance to deal with his enemy so soon. Neither Yvette nor Blanchot noticed that the guy was closely watching their conversation from the side. And the hero continued to shake because of the rage that arose from the depths of his heart. He was looking forward to the moment when he could kill the nasty and cunning Count. This morning, Alex had to dress up again, as the maids insisted on it. But it wasn't even this that worried the girl, that she had arrived at the training ground early. The girl noticed with surprise that the target remained completely untouched this time. Then Robert explained that the knights had started training earlier, so the young man trained separately. This somewhat reassured Miss, who would have liked Cyril's skills to improve as quickly as possible. The mentor could not help but notice what sweet thoughts ran through the lady's head, following the blush on her cheeks. The man himself was only glad that the boy had not abandoned his studies at the very beginning of his training. What delighted the girl most was that Cyril was so concerned about her. She didn't believe that the guy she initially suspected would become so close. So Alex no longer felt like she was alone in something important to her. The necklace on the guy's neck gave the lady confidence because it resembled her own. It was for this reason that the lady smiled so happily, despite the arrival of Count Corsica. For the first time since Mrs. Parents had left, Robert had seen Alex so calm. He understood that the girl's condition was due to Cyril, who had only recently joined them. The man could only continue to support Arno so that she would remain happy with everything. The mentor was accustomed to the fact that the lady often stood out among others for her originality and wit. And this time, Alex decided to show her fiancé everything she was made of. A few days later, the delegation of the Count of Corsica almost reached the lands of the Duchy of Arno. If Emilio sat calmly in the carriage awaiting arrival, his son could not behave the same way. The boy's name was Ion, and he had poor health and character, so he quickly got tired on trips. But the Count did not allow even his own son to relax, wanting to profit from him. Corsica rightly considered the lands of Arno to be among the most fertile in the rich empire. But the boy was not at all interested in the power that his father so strongly strove for. However, he listened to the Count in silence, since he did not dare to object to his crazy ideas. The Count's knights had almost reached the estate when they noticed something surprising ahead. Although no meeting had been arranged, knights from the Duchy of Arno rushed to them. The horses quickly approached the expensive carriage in which the Count sat with his son. Of course, this entire small detachment was led by Alex, who had planned such a surprise. Even Corsica couldn't predict that Bianca and Zachary's daughter would turn out to be so amazing. Alex could see in the man's eyes that she had made an impression on him, and this made her happy. The girl prepared the entire detachment in advance to meet her guests outside the estate. She gathered the best knights, whose task was to escort the Count to the estate of Duke Arno. They all smiled amiably at the guests, who arrived with the delegation to their territory. Only Robert remained as serious as usual, as his position required. Unlike his father, Ion decided that Alex had committed an unprecedented act of impudence by taking an army with her. It was the first time he had seen someone greet guests with knights ready for battle. But Arno was not shy about looking right inside the carriage where her guests were sitting. But the Count was not at all frightened by the situation that had developed outside the doors of his carriage. Alex also boldly met the gaze of the man who suddenly came out to meet her straight from the expensive carriage. Emilio was sure that Bianca must have had good reasons for inviting guests to the estate, so the aristocrat showed all his politeness so that the hosts would not have a bad impression of him. But Ion could not watch the friendly knights from the sidelines as easily as his father. Corsica noticed that his son was not happy with something, so he asked about the state of his beloved heir. At first, the boy did not want to admit what was tormenting him, even to his dear and close father. However, in the end, he said with disdain that he was not happy with the armed meeting that had been organized for them. The Count's face changed in a second, from kind to terrifying, which often happened to him. He recalled that, although all the knights were armed, they did not have any special protective armor. So assistants were called in to protect the guests from possible attacks from the outside. And the Count carefully made sure that his son smiled, even if it was a forced emotion. Corsica knew well the story of the surprise attack on the territory of the Duchy of Arno many years ago. Then, the already deceased ruler attacked the estate at the most inopportune moment, wanting to get it for himself. Zachary was at war, so it was Bianca who bravely responded to the attack of the insolent ruler. In Alex's actions, the Count saw a repetition of the events that happened to her mother. Ion didn't think that the girl would try her best to protect her important guests. He had rarely seen anyone take a liking to his father so quickly. But in reality, Corsica experienced completely different emotions when he watched the girl. He saw that she had achieved a lot during her training, despite her young age. However, Emilio was happy with the fact that Alex would give his son so many beautiful properties. Near the estate, all its inhabitants were already prepared to meet the delegation from the Corsica family. All this time, the hero watched from the sidelines as the man who so easily destroyed his life. He tried not to show his face among the crowd, in case the Count recognized him. The guy's hands were shaking treacherously because he was terribly afraid of such a cunning opponent. Although the young man was able to train his marksmanship, he never liked real hunting. And here, Cyril needed to kill a living person with his own hands, even if he was such a bad one. Only now did the boy realize how much he was afraid of taking someone else's life. He was no longer sure that he really had the right to treat Emilio like that. Sabran was brought out of his thoughts by Alex's voice, which sounded quite close. The most unpleasant thing for Cyril was that she was talking to the son of the Count of Corsica. The former prince remembered that it was Ion who became Alex's husband in his past life. And now the hero was not ready for this meeting, because he hated this weak man. Until now, Cyril had not known why Ion had not prevented his wife's death in the past. After this meeting, the guy finally decided for himself what exactly he should do. Only Lady Arno noticed that Sabran had left much earlier than the others. The young man was so immersed in his thoughts that he did not notice the lady's attentive gaze. Meanwhile, Alex increasingly secretly watched Cyril, to whom she was indebted, from the sidelines. But now the miss was busy with guests, so she couldn't catch up with her thoughtful friend. All Cyril could think about was that the Count must have been hit by a stray arrow. The hero had no idea how useful this action would be to thwart Emilio's plans. After all, for the sake of his insidious plan, the man did not rest even at night, arranging meetings. He had long ago sent a traitor to Arno, who loyally worked only for him. It was to this man that Corsica was going to entrust one matter related to Alex. Emilio planned to do all this in a couple of days, during the hunting festival. At the same time, at a public dinner, the man managed to behave completely naturally. He pretended to be truly delighted with the dishes prepared at Arno's estate. The Count kept praising the food, which further attracted everyone's attention. But Alex's appearance did not allow Emilio to focus all his attention only on himself. The girl, with the help of her maids, dressed herself more beautifully than she had ever dressed before. She modestly complimented herself, describing herself to the guests in the best light. But even such words were received with surprise by the Corsica family, since this was not the custom. Even in such a situation, Emilio found the right words, as he was a master of eloquence. So this time, too, he praised the lady who contained so many different talents. Alex smiled sweetly in response, although inside she remained wary of this man. Only to his subordinate did the Count admit that the miss irritated him with her intelligence and correctness. He had previously guessed from the girl's description that the Arnos had raised the heiress well. But Corsica didn't need a bride who would crush his son with her character alone. Therefore, he was going to crush the girl by any means necessary to make her more obedient. Emilio knew from experience that every person has something that will definitely intimidate them, and his secret assistant fully supported the master in all his cruel decisions. So, at the hunting festival, Alex was supposed to suffer, which the Count would definitely take care of. But no one else knew about this terrible plan, so preparations were in full swing, and only Ion, like a restless ghost, walked around, not knowing what to do with himself in this place. The guy had long since gotten tired of studying people he didn't even particularly like, and even Alex couldn't brighten up the hard days of the young man whom his father brought along. In fact, since childhood, the boy did not like hunting and everything connected with it. However, he was used to the fact that no one cared about his righteous emotions and thoughts. That's why the guy quickly became embarrassed when he admitted to the girl that he felt sorry for the animals. He himself did not expect that he would ever dare to tell the truth about his feelings. Ion was quite sure that any man would condemn him for such weakness among the aristocrats. However, Alex only smiled happily at the fact that her future husband was so kind. The boy had never encountered any support before, as his strict and cruel father had always only controlled him. He couldn't stand such an early intimacy with the lady, so he hurried to run away from sin. But Arno still concluded that her first impression of this young man was wrong. He looked more like a man who could not harm anyone, unlike his terrible father. But the girl was still afraid that the guy might not support her decision to become a knight. But for Alex, this dream was extremely important, and she did not want to give it up because of marriage. The lady involuntarily remembered Cyril, who had always silently remained on her side, no matter what. She was so deep in thought that she didn't notice how she approached a distant well in the middle of the estate's courtyard. Alex was surprised that in such an awkward and anxious moment, she remembered her friend. Before, the girl did not allow herself to look at other guys, because she still had no choice. Only Pierre accidentally noticed the Duke's daughter, who had secluded herself from everyone in the center of the courtyard. The man was worried that the lady might be late for the start of the hunt, so he reminded her about it. But at this moment in time, Alex was so overcome with her feelings that she couldn't think of anything else. Galleon did not immediately realize that what was required of him now was tactful silence, so that the lady could come to her senses. For the first time, Arno's face flushed deeply, and she couldn't hide it from the knight closest to her. Pierre always had a keen sense of the moment, and therefore did not ask unnecessary questions in such situations. He took some of the knights with him, because Alex promised that she would definitely catch up with them. And so the Duke's daughter was once again left alone with her disturbing thoughts about Cyril. The lady desperately tried to gather her emotions, because it was time for her to go hunting. The only thing that helped the girl was the memory that Pierre and Robert had also sincerely cared for her all their lives. Only after this did Alex calm down, although she still remained too careless and inattentive. It was precisely this state of the lady that the secret assistant who served the Count of Corsica took advantage of. He mercilessly pushed Alex in the back, causing her to fall straight into the deep well in the center of the courtyard. At that moment, all the knights had gone hunting, so no one noticed the disappearance of the Duke's important daughter. It took the girl a while to surface from the cold water, which restricted her movements. At first, she thought that she had just imagined it and had fallen into that deep place by mistake. Alex was certain she had seen some movement from above, so her rescue must be close. But instead of saving the miss, the unknown person closed the lid on the edge of the deep well. When the rope fell to the bottom, Alex finally realized that her fall down had not been a mistake at all. Fear and despair took over the lady's mind. Despite the fact that she had been trained to maintain her sanity in such situations, Miss could not find an answer to the question of who would need to treat her so cruelly. The Duke's daughter was not one to give up easily and quickly, even in such difficult situations. But this time, no matter how much the girl screamed, she did not hear a single response from outside. An ordinary well in the estate's courtyard became a real prison for the Duke's daughter in a matter of seconds. And Alex was not mentally prepared for the fact that someone would dare to attack her right on her home territory. Time passed, and the top of the well did not get any closer to the girl who was stuck at the very depths of its bottom. She was so tired she could barely stay afloat, feeling her strength gradually leaving her body. Lady Arno refused to believe that no one would really come to save her in such a situation. Panic and fear rose stronger and stronger in Mrs. Chest, no matter how hard she tried to control herself. But despair was gaining momentum and taking over, because no one noticed that the lady was missing. Now Alex didn't understand how Cyril had jumped into the icy water so fearlessly. After all, the guy didn't even think about the possible consequences, and the girl experienced all the delights of fear. But at that very moment, the desperate Lady Arno was called out from above by her beloved assistants. The Duke's daughter was so desperate that at first she didn't believe that she had actually been found. Sir Robert supported the lady from above, as he saw that her condition was extremely sad. The mentor commanded a small detachment of rescuers, having brought people to Miss in advance. So Alex only had a short amount of time to suffer, which made her happy. But then a huge splash was heard next to the lady, which she did not expect to see at all. Arno looked around warily, not understanding why the rope hit so hard. But it turned out that it was Cyril who jumped after the girl, wanting to help her get out. The guy was determined, despite the fact that he couldn't even speak properly. At the sight of him, the Duke's daughter could not hold back her tears, because she had suffered for so long in complete solitude. But now Miss had wonderful support, so she was able to cry to her heart's content. In fact, just an hour ago, Cyril was not within the estate, as he was hiding in the carriage. The guy decided not to attract anyone's attention, so he secretly made his way to the hunting ground. He took advantage of the general confusion and slipped unnoticed into the forest to take up a position. Sabran had already decided for himself that he would leave Arno as soon as he completed his revenge on the Count. So Corsica had very little time left to live, something he himself was completely unaware of. The man sat calmly on his horse, carefreely participating in the animal hunt with everyone else, and Cyril had already taken aim at him with his bow, intending to remove such a hated enemy. But at the most inopportune moment, the guy was overcome by incredible fear, because he had never killed before. Echoing his thoughts, a cloaked figure appeared behind him and announced that the Count's death would change nothing. The young man did not expect that the unknown man would appear near him again in daylight. Sabran sank to the ground in surprise, not expecting anyone to join him. Previously, this unknown person seemed to the former prince to be just a figment of his imagination. But it turned out that the man was quite real and alive, as evidenced by his appearance. However, they had no time to hesitate, because the magician knew that Alex was drowning in the well. Even Cyril, who traveled back in time, could not have foreseen such a turn of events, so the guy ran as fast as he could towards the estate, hoping to make it in time. In his haste, he left behind not only the unknown man, but also all his belongings. However, the most important thing for Cybran now was to save his beloved girl from trouble. Pierre successfully got the lady out first, and then helped the foreigner upstairs. Alex had time to think about a lot of things while she was freezing alone in the well for several hours. So Miss was going to hide the fact that someone pushed her into the well from the guests. Robert immediately understood the lady's state, so he did not push her to do anything else. He thought with horror that Count Corsica himself could be behind this incident. But Alex wasn't ready to accept the fact that she had suffered because of such important guests. The girl has experienced too much stress to look for someone to blame now. However, she had no time for tears, because she wanted to prove that she was strong enough. So Lady Arno asked to prepare other clothes for her to go hunting. Cyril was surprised that the Duke's daughter was so resilient despite her fear. She was able to act as if nothing terrible had just happened to her. So the Count did not know until the very end whether his assistant had been able to influence Duke Arno's daughter. The girl tried her best to hide her condition from the guest so that he would not be satisfied. But Emilio still noticed that the lady's hands were shaking with fear next to him. Therefore, the man was satisfied with the work of his assistant, who had done a good job. As soon as he got into the carriage, the Count felt someone's gaze on him. He looked around, feeling awkward about this strange and incomprehensible situation. And not far away on the mountain, the man noticed a man who had not taken his eyes off him all this time. It turned out to be Cyril, who had failed to kill Corsic, but was going to keep a close eye on him. The young man was no longer afraid that the Count would recognize him, because in this reality he was still little, and Corsica could not draw a parallel between the current prince and this grown man. However, he was outraged that some foreigner was staring at him so clearly before leaving. For certain reasons, the man hated everyone who was from the neighboring empire of Castile. At this time, some not very pleasant events were taking place in the main imperial palace. Bianca continued to sit diligently near the Empress's bed, but even this was no longer helping. The wise woman herself felt that she was gradually beginning to fade away as she slept more. But Duchess Arno skillfully supported the ruler, who was soon to die. It was only thanks to Bianca's presence that Odelia could blossom a little in bed. She admitted that she had not seen such bright and pleasant dreams for a long time. And Alex's mother played the role of a close friend every time, although she was worried about the woman's condition. More and more often, the Empress became immersed in memories of what had happened to her in the past. And now, Odelia recalled the situation that had split her friendship with Count Corsica 20 years ago. At that time, the woman had not yet become a ruler, so she could move freely around the cities. So she visited her old friend at the hour when he was at his worst because of the pain inside. Everyone around came to say goodbye to Emilio's sister, and Odelia was no exception. The guy was glad to see his close friend, although he was in no mood to smile right now. He was sincerely worried about the fact that he could not save his beloved sister from a terrible death. The future Empress understood how hard it was for her friend, so she came to support him. The Count was completely devastated by the death of his sister, because they had been twins since childhood. Eloisa was no longer in this world, and Emilio could not accept this sad fact. He had still come to terms with the death of his father, but the death of his sister was a completely different matter for the guy. The suffering was clearly visible on the face of the Count, who could not contain his emotions. Odelia herself was worried about the death of such a young and beautiful girl she knew, but now was not the time for her sadness, because it was much more difficult for her brother to lose his sister. The woman could do nothing to ease the suffering of her close family. But she did not expect that, from now on, the Count was going to look for the Castilian pirates who killed Eloise. Odelia had never encountered people who were so overcome by a sense of revenge before. But Emilio wasn't going to sit still after his loved one was gone, due to the fault of others. Until now, the Empress remembered with sadness those times when she could not change anything. But even now she saw no other way out, so the story would still come to this. A few years later, her nephew married a Castilian princess, which was approved by the emperor. None of the aristocrats were against this marriage, which was supposed to unite the two countries. And only Corsica could not calmly watch his enemies invade the territory of the empire. At that moment, Odelia tried to explain to her friend that this union would be beneficial for everyone. But she quickly realized that all reasonable words did not reach the grief-stricken Emilio. The man was still suffering, even though many years had passed since his sister's death, but her dying cries were still visualized in his head, which prevented the Count from living. So from now on, Corsica showed a malicious interest in what was happening in the ruling family, and Odelia could not calm her friend, who suffered from hatred towards Castile. She saw all his madness, which was directed at the future heir to the empire. At that moment, the woman was so scared that she moved away from her former friend, and now the Empress would have acted differently, but all this no longer made any sense. She only regretted that she could not continue to maintain her friendship with the Count, whom she liked. However, as a ruler, she had responsibilities that could not be abandoned. Odelia was sad that her days were numbered, and Cyril never grew up to be an heir. Bianca supported the ruler with all her might, confident that everything would be fine at home. After all, she left the estate to her precocious daughter, whom she often thought about outside the home. At that moment, the sick lady was lying in bed, having caught a cold after bathing in the well. Vincent was by her side to ease Alex's worries about her friend. This was because at the moment, Cyril was not allowed to appear at Arno's estate. Although the guy saved the Duke's daughter, for some reason no one considered him a hero after that. As sad as Alex was, for political reasons, she couldn't defend her friend. Miss had no idea that a foreigner could be so repulsed by the locals out of superstitious fear. The question of the traitor troubled the minds of Robert and Langdon, who faithfully served the Arno family. The mentor was confident that none of his students would side with the Count of Corsica, but they could not verify this assumption in any way, because the traitor did not reveal himself. So, until the wedding itself, Alex could only guess who was trying to harm the lady, but the butler had no intention of sitting still while his mistress was in danger. He had long been suggesting that Lady Arno be taken to another city for training for her safety. At that moment, all Cyril's thoughts were occupied only by the state of his beloved girl in the estate. He remembered well how much she had been shaking at the moment of her rescue from the cold well, and the guy understood that this trembling was not caused by the cold at all, but by wild fear and stress. That unknown man also did not leave Cyril's mind, as he raised many questions. He believed that the magician was on his side, but for some reason he did not give clear answers. So the former prince was completely confused by the huge number of thoughts in his head. The guy didn't quite understand what he had to do to save Alex from death. The only thing that was clear to him was that the death of the Count of Corsica would not change anything in the near future. Unlike Emilio, Cyril still had no worthy allies, even though he was reborn. Even in his past life, it was too difficult for him to win the hearts of other people. The guy was distracted from his thoughts by Robert's voice, who unexpectedly knocked on his door. The mentor hadn't warned anyone about his visit, so he was lucky that the young man was still awake. Sabran was absolutely sure that he had followed all the man's instructions, so he didn't understand why he had come. It turned out that Robert had brought warm clothes for the boy, since he had nothing. Cyril was delighted to receive such pleasant help from the outside, as he was not prepared for the cold. The teacher guessed the size well, so the prince had no trouble putting on the prepared clothes. To test how warm it would be, the man invited the student to go for a walk with him. Cyril trusted Robert so much that he had no questions even when he saw Vincent. But the young man was absolutely sure that the old man would usually have been asleep for a long time at this late hour. But now, Blanchot looked as if he was saying goodbye to his beloved Cyril. The guy still couldn't speak, so he never voiced all the previously unasked questions. For some reason, it seemed to the prince that the old man was mentally praying for his well-being and health. This caused even more misunderstandings to blossom within Sabran, which he could not resolve. Vincent waved to the departing people until the very end, something he never usually did in his life. For some reason, this whole situation made Cyril feel more and more uncomfortable with each passing moment. But Robert behaved as usual, as if nothing strange had happened at that moment. In fact, the mentor had planned a test for the student, which is why he maintained such secrecy. Sabran silently carried out all the teacher's requests, without thinking about why all this was necessary. Although with each passing moment, the questions in the guy's head became more and more numerous. But Robert pretended to be intently studying how far the boy had advanced in shooting. The young man was surprised when the teacher found his things after the hunting festival. He completely forgot that he had never picked up the bag of food that he had taken with him on the road. So now the mentor quite rightly suspected Cyril of a possible attack on the Count. Sabran found himself in a disadvantageous situation because he couldn't even speak properly. Meanwhile, Robert remembered how many years ago a kidnapper took away a young lady. He had to abandon her on the way and jump into the river. But at that moment, the guy did not die. For many years, everyone in Arno believed the kidnapper was dead, until Cyril proved that it was possible to survive. So the mentor had a logical question about whether the guy knew about such a loophole. The teacher could not assume anything other than that the young man was trying to gain his trust. Only now did Cyril realize why, after all this time, he had been unable to find any friends. Although in fact the prince was not guilty of anything, he could not prove otherwise. So the guy had to silently accept all the accusations that Robert had thrown at him. The man noticed all the suspicious actions on the student's part recently. However, Cyril wanted at least this wise man to be able to believe in his innocence. In a short period of time, he was able to become attached to his mentor, who managed to do a lot for him. And Sabran will cherish these moments for the rest of his life, because he never had them before. Periodically, Robert reminded the hero of his real father, although they were not blood relatives. Therefore, it was very important for Cyril to prove only to him that he was not a traitor. He gave the bow to the mentor and hinted that he could kill him at any moment if he wished. Of course, Sabran hoped that his life would be spared, since no one else could save Alex. Suddenly, deep memories overwhelmed the young man, and he realized that his thoughts had flown away somewhere. This sensation reminded him of the same strange feelings that he had experienced not long ago. While jumping into the water after Vincent, something happened to the hero that he had not thought about before. But then the guy saw not only the muddy and cold water that was swirling around him. From somewhere, a memory of the day Alex lost Blanchot came into Cyril's head. And now, Sabran went to his room in the Imperial Palace, where he was alone. At that time, the boy's mother had just returned to her homeland, so he was not yet used to being alone. At that time, the young prince had not yet met Alex, so he had no close friends at all. Sabran was dying to correct this injustice that had developed around him, although he couldn't touch himself, as he was just a ghostly shell in this place. But the young man had the power to save the girl, who suddenly appeared right next to him. Cyril didn't expect this outcome, so he shyly moved away from her as far as possible. But the lady didn't think any worse of the guy because he allowed himself to cry. In fact, the girl didn't even think of doubting Cyril, because he had already saved her many times. She explained that she had planned to take the guy with her anyway, because she believed in him. But Robert still volunteered to personally check all the young man's plans for the lady. Sabran had no idea that his mentor had no intention of doubting him, but was doing what he had to. Pierre was the most happy for Cyril, because now everyone in their company could trust him. Gallian knew that if the young man had turned out to be a spy, he would have fled at the very beginning of the investigation. But no one can be a traitor when they have such cute puppy eyes on a permanent basis. While the men were discussing the details, Alex announced that she would be studying in other lands. A few days ago, the lady underwent an initiation that allowed her to secure her lands. The butler personally ensured that the girl became a knight and owned the Duchy of Arno herself. But before she grew up, they still had a long way to go, although the plan had already been outlined. Vincent supported such a difficult decision that would not allow anyone to take away Alex's power. Zachary and Bianca would be only glad if the lady continued to rule after her marriage. And to do this, she needed to obtain the status of a knight, which Langdon had worked so hard for. The only thing that bothered the girl was that her trip to other lands had fallen through at the preparation stage. She didn't know that in fact the assistants hadn't abandoned the idea, but had put it on hold for a while. All this happened because Mrs. Parents were faced with the breakdown of the peace treaty. They didn't want their beloved daughter to be forced to lead an army of knights. So Zachary and Bianca tried to do everything to ensure that the girl's childhood remained carefree. As a noble lady, Alex could have led a calm and measured life. No one asked Lady Arno's wishes, but she didn't want to be an ordinary aristocrat. This path had to be abandoned, as those close to her noticed that Miss had already been drawn into battle. If it weren't for that assassination attempt on Alex, she would have continued peacefully preparing for her upcoming marriage. But there was an assumption that the Count of Corsica himself was behind the assassination attempt on Arno, asking for his hand in marriage. What angered the mentor most was that the man was refusing to help Zachary's troops. But the teacher did not want to put pressure on his student to give her the opportunity to decide her own fate. And Alex knew exactly what she would do in the near future, despite the danger from the outside. Even Robert didn't expect the lady's plan to be so well thought out, down to the last detail. She asked everyone to pretend that she had locked herself in a room to prepare for marriage. But in fact, The girl planned to secretly leave the estate to study knighthood. For such a difficult trip, Alex needed people he could trust. That's why she asked her assistants to check everyone the lady would take with her on the hike. This is how Cyril found himself drawn into this journey, although he had nothing against it. Robert had thought out in advance the route that Pierre, Alex, and the foreigner would take. He sent them to the Neustria family, where his good friend, who could be trusted, lived. Gallio's mentor gave him a chess piece, which would signal that they were friends. Pierre had heard before that Robert had a chess friend, but he didn't know all the details. But problems arose after just a few days of travel, and the friends had not yet left the Arno. Pierre was worried about the condition of Cyril's feet, under whose nails pus had already begun to accumulate. The guy himself did not expect that he would be so unprepared for further travel. Even Alex couldn't calmly accept the fact that the young man's nails needed to be urgently removed. But if there was no other way out, the lady would prefer to get her friend back on his feet as quickly as possible. So she supported Pierre's crazy idea that they should go down to the village. Alex remembered how brave Cyril could be, so she had no doubt that he could handle it. But the hero himself was afraid to even think about what lay ahead because of problems with his toenails. Cybran had never experienced such intense shame in his entire life. He would have understood if he had been wounded by a sword, but his current situation was more dire. Alex continued to cheerfully support her friend, but this didn't make things any easier for him. Soon the whole company arrived at the first village, where Cybran could receive assistance. Pierre immediately gave instructions to Lady Arno that from now on they would play the role of ordinary brother and sister. It was no trouble for the girl to address Gallio in this way, whom she already considered an older brother. Since Cyril still couldn't speak, there certainly wouldn't be any problems with him. Pierre was the happiest of all at the opportunity to finally eat warm food and swim in warm water. When he stepped forward, Alex told how warmly she had interacted with Gaston and Pierre as a child. Then the boys really were like real older brothers to the little lady. It was from then on that the girl began to look up to Gallio, who was a good example for her. Cyril listened with interest to this short story about part of Arno's life as a child. These were the moments that had previously been unknown to him, the ones that made Alex who he recognized. But the girl was able to grow into a beautiful and mischievous woman who retained her wisdom. And only now were Cybran discovering the character traits of the lady who was trying to be like her brother. Gallion made the former prince feel admiration and respect for him, so the young man could well understand the feelings of the lady who was looking up to the knight. But now all his thoughts were occupied only by his legs, which were very painful due to the suppuration. As soon as they arrived at the village, one of the old women immediately helped Cyril with his legs. None of the team expected that if he did, the boy would lose his limbs. Pierre was especially outraged by the old woman's words, deciding that she was an ordinary charlatan. But Grandma knew for sure that pus was not something to joke about, so Cyril was very lucky to have her. The company was not nearly as well prepared in terms of medicine, so it could not argue. Gallio was glad that they had come down from the mountains in time and had not continued on their way. Along the way, many people showed interest in the travelers out of pure curiosity and kindness, and the knight told each one that they were looking for a snow leopard skin for the Castilian lady. The good-natured merchant informed us that another group of people had passed through here not long ago. He, as usual, asked where these strangers were heading, which was what everyone was interested in, but their leader, with a terrible scar on his face, made it clear to the man that he had better not ask questions. The merchant had never encountered such an unfriendly and angry person before. But what bothered the commoner most was that the children next to that man were confused, as if they had actually been stolen a long time ago and were now being taken to other lands for sale. Pierre had not heard for a long time about the slave trade, which was prohibited in their country. But since the people were heading to a neighboring state, the merchant did not say anything. Even Cyril remembered the slave trade, as he had read about it in documents in the palace. True, the guy could not remember the details of the incident he had heard about. Meanwhile, Alex helped the old woman with vegetables, thereby paying for the housing provided. But by chance, she noticed a guy not far from her, whom she recognized as her old friend. It was definitely Gaston, with whom the girl had been in close contact since childhood at the estate. She couldn't help but turn to this guy, although at first she couldn't believe her eyes. The young man turned around, and the lady clearly recognized in him the man she perceived as a brother. Langdon's son immediately recognized Alex, as they knew each other well. Both of them were amazed, because neither of them expected to see each other suddenly. Although Miss was glad to see her friend, she had no idea what situation he was in. Gaston was not allowed to tell anyone about his affairs, because they were practically illegal. Each lied about their location, as they had different reasons for doing so. But now it became clear that the lady was not preparing for the engagement at all, while sitting in Arnaud's estate. But the guy didn't undergo nightly training with the Count of Corsica, as he had told everyone before. At that moment, Cyril went out to look for Alex, who had been very late on her walk. He immediately noticed a girl who was talking to a man he had never met before. But then some tall man accidentally touched the young man with his shoulder, and he didn't even notice it. Cybran was still unsteady on his feet, so he fell even from such a light poke. Cyril was completely at a loss because of the incident, because too much had fallen on him. The man did not pass by when he saw this situation and offered his hand to the person he had dropped. As soon as the former prince looked at the stranger's face, he realized that he had seen him somewhere before. But right now, memory refused to give clear answers to the questions of who the man was. Meanwhile, his face with an ugly scar was impossible to forget if you saw it once. The man paid no attention to Cyril, as he did not recognize him as the heir. Instead, he called Gaston, and the boy became visibly frightened as the leader approached. Langdon's son immediately reported that the horses were ready and they could set off. He could only hope that the girl would keep the fact that she had seen him a secret. Gaston had too little time for further conversation, so he ran away. And Alex was left with a bunch of questions that she couldn't ask her close childhood friend. The young man was forced to serve the people to whom he was subordinate. But Gaston's soul still lived in the Arnaud estate, where he had been educated since childhood. Cyril only now recognized Yvette's brother, as he had never met him before. The vague feeling that these two were familiar to him still did not leave the hero. Suddenly, he remembered where exactly he had seen Gaston, with his scary-looking mentor. Horror gripped the prince's mind as he realized how important these people were in the future. They were the main followers of the Count of Corsica, and helped only him in everything. So this guy's fate was clear to Cybran unless he tried to change it. Otherwise, this good young man will quickly take the Count's side, even if he doesn't want to. Alex was as lost in thought as Cyril, although she had her own reasons for it. The guy was sad to realize that in the future, the lady was betrayed by such a close person. But now Arnaud had no idea about the possible pain of losing Gaston. She was sure that Langdon's son would never tell anyone that he had seen her. Therefore, the girl asked Cyril not to hint to anyone about Gaston's presence in this village. Although the hero was against this, he still loved Alex, so he did not go against her. Only now did Duke Arnaud's daughter notice the state her friend was in. His legs were carefully bandaged, but this did not improve Cybran's condition much. The girl couldn't even imagine that her friend would be so worried about her absence. For Alex, it was much more important that Cyril had time to recover before they left. Therefore, she asked the young man not to act so recklessly towards himself again. The hero himself understood perfectly well that he had fallen as a heavy burden on all the participants of the expedition. He wished he could be more helpful, but in the current situation, he was in desperate need of care himself. Cyril's condition was so dire that he couldn't even keep up with the lady. She didn't immediately notice this, along with the sadness on the face of the young man, who felt like a burden. The hero needed words of support and consolation, because he was only driving himself deeper into the hole. He didn't have time to stop before he crashed into a lady who, for some reason, stopped in the middle of the road. Alex thought about how Cyril had bravely jumped into the river to save Vincent from death. And then he jumped into the well for the lady, although he himself could have been quite seriously hurt. Lady Arnaud admitted that after those two moments, any water became her weakness. The girl's hands trembled just at the thought that they would have to cross the river someday. With this, the lady wanted to show her friend that everyone had their own weaknesses, and that was okay. But because of their friendship, they could help each other in various critical situations. In fact, Cybran had long wanted to hear from Alex that he had been useful to her. Therefore, this request for help in the future was imprinted in the guy's subconscious with gratitude. Throughout his childhood, he dreamed of becoming a support for the girl he had feelings for. And now, at last, this moment had come, because by chance, Lady Arnaud was now younger. So for the first time in a long time, the hero could smile happily, enjoying communication with Alex. Seeing the guy's joyful smile, the lady remembered how many times she had noticed his tears before. From the very moment of their meeting, something constantly troubled the young man, causing him to cry from helplessness. And even at night, Cyril could not sleep normally, which the lady found out about completely by accident. Since then, She felt sympathy for the guy whose last name she had no opportunity to find out. Alex only wanted Cyril to continue smiling happily next to her. This moment will remain in the hearts of each of the friends who became attached to each other for a long time. But they didn't know that their friend's life was much more complicated and sad. Gaston had to lie that the girl was trying to sell him medicinal herbs. More than anything, he was afraid that his mentor would end up dissatisfied with him for some reason. This man hid his name from everyone around him and demanded the same from his closest subordinates. In fact, he held Gaston hostage because he constantly threatened to kill his family. The poor guy had to choose between the lives of people he cared about. And so far, he had managed to avoid touching Alex, but that could quickly change in the future. That same day, the assistants discussed with Bianca all the latest events in their family. The women were upset that Alex's trip had not happened, and they sent only Gaston. They understood perfectly well that the guy had become a hostage of the situation, unable to return home. This news hit Yvonne the hardest, as she was the mother of Gaston and Yvette. Duchess Arnaud saw how hard it was for her friend, but she could do nothing to help. So the woman had to hold on for the sake of the future of Arnaud's estate and her children. She had suspected from the very beginning that something similar might happen to Gaston in the future. But even so, the woman did not stop her husband, who decided to make a night out of his son. She could only hope that this good boy would not suffer because of the adult's decisions. Meanwhile, Alex's company was still in the village, recuperating. Cyril tried to help his grandmother in everything, but he could not ignore Lady Arnaud's condition. He constantly noticed that a thoughtful and sad expression involuntarily crossed her face. No matter how hard Alex tried to be strong, she couldn't shake off her worries about Gaston. Pierre worked hard to be fully prepared for the further journey. The man needed to find horses somewhere, although this was not originally planned. But he was able to find out that there would be a difficult place where the horses could make the journey easier. As usual, Cyril went after the lady and accidentally overheard part of her conversation. It turned out that Alex was very worried about whether they had really missed the slave traders in the village. Pierre couldn't say anything specific, but he knew that children of different ages were constantly disappearing. Only now did Sebrun remember that he had once read about a similar incident at the estate. Then the curious Alex, with a purpose unknown to him, went through all the old palace files. This is how the girl accidentally stumbled upon information about the disappearance of a bunch of children. She was surprised that no one started looking for the missing people, who might have been enslaved. At that moment, Cyril was not interested in who benefited from this business and for what purpose. But now he had to face this situation personally, so he had to think. Once again, Alex involuntarily pursed her lips, which betrayed her deep thoughtfulness. The girl began to monotonously help Pierre, although her thoughts were elsewhere. The man knew his mistress well, so he could not help but notice her strange state. Lady Arnaud didn't expect Gallion to suddenly tug at her pigtail to get her attention. Seeing this, Cyril could hardly resist interfering in the conversation between his friends. But in reality, Pierre was simply using this method to get Alex to look at him. He remembered that if a lady didn't like something, she wouldn't be able to listen to others properly. The Duke's daughter had completely forgotten how attentive her mentor had been since childhood. She really did think constantly about going back and taking Gaston with her. This is what the lady anxiously voiced to Galio in the hope that he would support her decision. Alex was unsure until the very end whether she should confess her worries to the knight. Only Cyril understood perfectly well how much courage it took for the girl to do this. After all, she herself asked him to keep everything a secret, but in the end, she couldn't withstand the moral pressure. Sebrun felt partly envious, because Sir Pierre turned out to be a reliable man for the lady, while the guy was not sure that the miss would go to him for advice if needed. However, contrary to Alex's expectations, Gallion immediately refused her request. Duke Arnaud's daughter could not believe her ears, because Gaston was close to the knight. The girl hoped that she would be able to smile like before next to the guy who was dear to her, but Pierre wisely noted that the young man had a secret that he could not reveal to anyone. No matter how much the lady worried about her friend, it would not have been possible to take him away so easily. But Gallion was the leader of the group and could not risk the lady, whose identity had to be hidden. In an attempt to save Langdon's son, there was a high chance that someone would recognize Alex. Although the man's words contradicted the lady's feelings, she could not help but agree with him. Arnaud still hadn't learned to let go of people who were in perceived danger, but she was lucky, because the wise Pierre was always there to support the girl. Only with the help of the knight did Miss realize how childish her desires had been until now. Galleon was only glad that Alex was growing internally right before his eyes. The girl completely trusted the knight, who had already proven his loyalty to her in business many times. And this time, the man said that an order from the duke's daughter would be higher than an order from the butler. Only now did Alex realize that Pierre was ready to break his promises to the estate for her. However, the time came when the lady needed to learn to take responsibility for her actions. Therefore, she did not change their original travel plan so as not to spoil anything. Gallia was pleased that they did not have to break the peace with each other. However, business did not wait, so the man ended their short conversation in private. As soon as Pierre turned the corner, his attentiveness made him notice something. There were barely noticeable traces of Cyril on the ground, although the boy himself never showed himself to his friends. Gallio certainly could not have been mistaken in his observations, since he had been trained in this since childhood. But he did not inform the lady that their friend had run away for some reason. At this point, Sabran was not ready to talk to anyone from the company he was traveling with. The guy was completely overwhelmed by emotions when he accidentally saw a picture he was not prepared for. It would seem that Alex was simply expressing boundless respect for the elder who cared for her. But the girl's face at that moment was flushed and too cute for the former prince. He ran away only because envy of Pierre was tearing him apart from the inside. Before, the hero would never have thought that he would miss Alex so much, who was nearby. Within a few days, the whole company was ready to move out. As the preparations were complete, Galleon only now realized that Cyril might not know how to ride a horse. In fact, this was one of the best skills of the former prince who trained a lot. Back in the imperial palace, Alex personally taught him some important aspects of riding. The girl always spoke about horses with a joyful smile, because she loved riding them. Her memories were connected with her father, who was no longer alive at that time. However, in this reality, the guy pretended to have lost his memory, so he did not admit to his ability. Then Pierre easily asked Alex to carry Cyril on his horse the rest of the way. Lady Arno did not expect to be given such a huge responsibility so quickly. Gallio's request was quite logical, since he could only get 2 small horses. From the girl's face, Cyril could see how embarrassed she was by the forced situation. She tried not to meet the young man's gaze, so as not to blush even more. The guy could understand the lady because she was the duke's daughter, and such incidents happened here. To his surprise, Alex quickly agreed to her new mission, which the hero did not expect. But he himself no longer had the right to refuse, since there was no other way out anyway. The lady enthusiastically promised that she would definitely deliver her friend without a single scratch. But this didn't make the embarrassed former prince feel any better, because he was experiencing shame. Even before leaving, Cyril regretted not having confessed his ability to ride. Sweat poured down Sabran's face from excitement, which only made him feel even more worried. In a panic, the guy couldn't find anything to hold on to during their trip. So Alex herself showed the young man exactly how to hold her so that everyone would be comfortable. The girl delicately ignored her friend's red face, as she did not want to embarrass him. So the whole company was ready to move on to the neighboring territories. Their journey lasted so long that the young man had time to get used to this type of travel. But soon, the friends encountered an unexpected obstacle in the form of a flooded river. Pierre immediately realized that they would have to cross it only on horseback, practically by swimming. Alex investigated the surrounding area, but there was no bridge around. Meanwhile, the girl was able to see flags that belonged to a neighboring state. It was beneficial for the girl to contact people on the other side to ask for help. But even for this, they first had to cross a turbulent river. Besides, Gallio doubted that Count Nestria would be kind to them. He had previously had to deal with this stern man because he needed help. However, the man refused without hesitation, as he was only concerned about his own country. No matter how much Zachary talked to the aristocrat, it did not lead to positive results. The Count stood firm in his desire to protect only what belonged to him. So even now, Pierre was not sure how the owner of the territory would react to their arrival. Robert knew in advance about the ruler's character, so he sent them to his chess friend. So the company had no choice but to stick to the original plan. And for this reason, Gallio gave the order to cross the river precisely in this stormy place. Alex froze in horror, as she was not mentally prepared for such a situation. The girl's condition did not escape the notice of Cyril, who always kept a close eye on her. It was clear that this river was narrower than the Arno, but even so, the lady's fear was high. It was only because of the recent rains that the water level had risen, which frightened Miss to death. She couldn't even think about actually crossing the water with the help of a horse, Cyril's mind flashed back to the moment when Alex had confessed her newfound weakness to him. Pierre was the first to fearlessly head into the water, because there was nothing dangerous about this crossing. It was only after a minute that he noticed that Lady Arno, for some reason, was not following him evenly. The Duke's daughter was so frightened that she could hardly command her horse to move forward. The animal itself behaved as if it never wanted to cross the river. Gallio found the horse's behavior strange, as it had never had such problems before. Only Sabran understood why this situation happened specifically with Alex's horse. Despite his young age, he absorbed well all the lessons from wise adults. So the boy remembered Alex's words about horses being very empathetic animals. Lady Arno believed that if the rider trembled with fear, the animal would support him. And now the girl could not move a finger from the horror that gripped her entire body. So the lady's fate was once again in the hands of Cyril, who had no intention of abandoning her halfway. Pierre was too busy with his own horse to help his lady cross the river. But Alex needed all the help she could get, because she couldn't do anything on her own. So the hero boldly jumped straight into the water to take the reins that controlled the horse. Now the young man could only support the miss for whom he had feelings in this way. And for the sake of his beloved, Cyril was ready to do anything, so he ignored the icy cold of the water. Pierre rushed to help, but Sabran managed to get Alex across the river himself. Gallio took one look at the foreigner to realize that he was frozen to death. Summer had long since passed, so Cyril received no warmth from the cold weather or water. As soon as they moved away from the river, the lady instantly came to her senses, throwing off the remnants of her fear. Now all her thoughts were occupied only with concern for the condition of her frozen friend. The lady couldn't believe that the guy actually tried so hard to help her. She didn't know that Cyril had already fallen in love with her in his past life. So now the former prince was full of desire to support the lady on her difficult path. Meanwhile, at Nestria's estate, the maid was trying her best to find her mistress, who had disappeared somewhere. Only at the very last moment did she realize that the woman had escaped from everyone to the roof. Madame Eva had a unique character and personality, which was clear at first glance, so she listened little to advice from others, because she knew what was best for her. The woman tried to enjoy the last rays of the sun, which were few. She looked into the distance, as if she had a premonition of the imminent appearance of her friend's acquaintances. The entire company successfully reached the estate in just half a day after crossing the river. But Pierre was still in a hurry to meet the woman, so he handed the figurine over to the guards. Only Robert knew what message he had sent with this piece of chess. This unusual greeting from the guests was immediately conveyed to the lady who ruled the estate in her husband's absence. It was not difficult for Eva to understand at first glance who exactly this message was sent from. She treated Robert well, although they had not been able to play together in recent years. Although the friends arrived at their destination, Alex was haunted by Cyril's condition. The hero was so cold during the plunge into the water that he could not warm up even in the warmth. Even with the naked eye, it was clear how bad the former prince was now. In fact, Sabran was ready to lose consciousness at any moment due to the cold inside. But he tried to hold on, because he wanted to make a good impression on his friend Robert. Moreover, the guy was encouraged by the fact that Alex was sincerely concerned about his well-being. That's why the young man continued to force a smile, no matter how hard it was for him to do so. And soon the traveler's wait was rewarded, as the mistress of the estate came out to meet them. At the sight of her, the air froze in place, since he knew this woman well from his past life. But the hero didn't expect that Madame would be at Nestria's estate at that moment. Eva helped the little prince out many times in his past life, as she was his mentor. It was thanks to her support that Cyril's character was significantly strengthened in a short period of time. But the guy was not prepared to meet this wise and strict woman so soon. As a child, it was her that Sabran feared most, so this meeting was the last straw for him. No one expected that the foreigner would suddenly lose consciousness at such an important moment of greeting. The young man's head was still fresh, with all the instructions from Madame Eva, who had been assigned to him. She tried to raise her heir to be a good ruler, so that no one would turn away from him. After all, it was during the reign of evil emperors that rebellions most often arose. Eva taught Cyril the balance between compassion and strictness to help him succeed on the throne. Even if the boy had known earlier that this advice would not help him, he would still have listened to it. During her short service, the heir managed to become attached to this beautiful woman. But just a year later, she was executed as a spy, and the future ruler was unable to resist it. Only after a couple of hours the heir was able to come to his senses, although it was difficult for him. All this time, Pierre and Alex did not leave their friend's bedside, as they were very worried about him. The boy's condition was still deplorable, despite the fact that he was wrapped in warm clothes. Cyril was slow to think, so he didn't immediately remember where exactly they were now. And immediately shame for his behavior washed over the young man, although he was not guilty of anything. Lady Arno felt a little better when she realized that Cyril's life was no longer in danger. When he lost consciousness, no one understood what to do in such a situation. And only Madame Eva did not lose her head, since iron discipline and calmness were in her blood. The woman understood that now was not the right time for conversation, because she needed to help the young man. So she temporarily moved the guests into the room, suggesting they discuss everything later. As soon as the hero heard the details after his fainting, his morale only worsened. He couldn't believe that he had ruined such an important meeting for everyone at such an inopportune time. At that moment, Ava's assistant delicately looked into the room, as she had business to attend to. Her mistress gave the order to bring a man with silver hair to the audience. Although Alex did not want to leave Cyril alone, she had no right to refuse the invitation. Pierre stepped forward to protect the girl and introduce himself as the group's leader. But the maid was adamant about Ava's decisions, which were never discussed in the estate. So Gallio was quickly defeated by the woman's cold and confident onslaught. Cyril watched in amazement at this display of courage towards a man of higher status. But the maid herself behaved as if she interacted with aristocrats below her rank every day. To avoid an unnecessary argument, Alex agreed to a private conversation with Madame Nestria. The girl revealed her face, as there was no longer any need to hide her identity. She ordered Pierre to keep an eye on Cyril and not to worry about the conversation that was about to take place. But it was easier said than done, because Gallion was not used to letting a lady go alone. It was no easier for the knight Sebren, who tried to secretly follow Alex everywhere. The Duke's daughter was wary at her first meeting with Robert's chess friend. She was not at all surprised when she saw that very same chess game on the tea table. But the girl did not expect that Madame would invite her to play to relieve boredom. Eva was sure that Robert would definitely teach the lady how to play correctly. Alex was surprised that the woman knew in advance who she really was. But Madame did not have intuition, because the mentor himself told everything in their secret language. Often old friends used secret figures to communicate, the meaning of which only they understood. Chess was a game of encrypted real-life characters, each playing their own special role. And the horse symbolized the desire to become a knight, which only Alex of Arno possessed. The girl had no idea that someone could express themselves in such a simple and clever way. Lady Arno was not one to back down, so she asked to be knighted. But Count Nestria was absent, so there was no one to perform this important ceremony. Even Eva herself had no idea when her husband would return to the estate after a protracted war. The woman did not expect that her guest would turn out to be such an impatient and wayward girl. Alex didn't want to remain in the dark, so she demanded a meeting with the Count of Nestria himself. The determination in Mrs. Eyes told Eva that she would never give up on her desire. Alex was not in a hurry with the initiation for no reason, because she had good reasons for it. There was a high probability that Gaston had nevertheless found himself drawn into an unpleasant and dangerous situation. So circumstances developed in such a way that the lady needed support from Count Nestria. Eva was a smart enough woman to guess that there was a connection to the slave trade. Pierre had already said this, but no one knew how and why children were stolen. Alex was surprised that Madame hit the nail on the head, even though she wasn't in the know. The woman knew that during wartime, as many people as possible were often kidnapped and sold. But the current situation was different, because people were disappearing incredibly quickly. Even in the Count's territories, rumors were already circulating about more missing children. The state was already short of workers, so any losses were felt especially acutely. This gave Alex another reason to meet with the ruler of Nestria. Only Eva knew that Joachim was an extremely secretive and conservative person, so he would not allow an aristocrat from another state to interfere in his affairs. Even the fact that Madame told the lady about the circumstances already earned her punishment. The Duke's daughter never thought that such complex obstacles would arise on her difficult path. She sincerely suffered from the fact that she could not help her beloved relative in captivity. Eva understood the girl's emotions, but it was too early to act actively. Since Robert had entrusted Alex's care to Madame, the woman was going to do everything possible. The lady's heart couldn't take the promise of support, and she burst into tears happily. Eva felt sorry for the Duke's daughter, but she tried to adhere to all the rules of Count Nestria. But the woman had something to offer the young guest, who was so moved by her presence. The thing was that Muriel d'Abbeville, who was Alex's friend, was in this estate. At this time, Cyril was restless with worry. But Pierre would not let him go anywhere. The man had to stay close to the boy so that neither of them would do anything wrong. Gallio hoped that the foreigner would not become completely ill, as this would create problems for everyone. The hero himself understood that now was not the right time for his general malaise. He was absolutely sure that Alex would blame himself if his friend got sick. Cyril was so deep in thought that he didn't notice Pierre watching him closely. So the question about his feelings for Lady Arno caught the poor hero off guard with its unexpectedness. The food scattered across the bed in panic was the best answer to whether Sabran loved Alex. With a sigh, Gallio admitted that he didn't understand how he had ever distrusted such a nice guy. The former prince did not know what reaction the knight would receive to his silent confession, and Pierre remained calm, although he asked Cyril to be careful with his feelings. He recalled that a groom for the girl had long ago been chosen from among the noble aristocrats. Sabran knew this nuance better than anyone, as well as many other things about Lady Arno. He still remembered with sadness the past, when he couldn't even get close to the girl. This is because at the time of their first meeting, Alex was already married and did not look at others. Moreover, their age difference played a huge role in this, so there was no talk of love. No matter how well Lady Arno treated her ward, he was just a child to her. Even when Cyril grew up, nothing changed in their relationship because it couldn't. A heavy and unpleasant sadness about this constantly ate away at the former prince from the inside. He really needed advice from the magician who knew how to change Alex's future. Perhaps there was still a possibility that the lady would not marry the son of the Count of Corsica. And then Cyril will definitely not miss such an ideal chance for himself, because he could not live without a lady. In his dreams, Alex only gave him a happy smile, always staying next to the guy. But at that moment, the young man's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp and noisy intrusion into their room. The red-haired girl with the face of a demon rushed inside, but later realized that she was mistaken. With the manners and etiquette of a lady, she bowed and asked forgiveness from the unexpected guests, but immediately after this, the lady rushed off down the corridor like a whirlwind, as she was clearly carried away by something. The guys looked at this noisy person with surprise, whom they did not expect to see. Pierre had never heard of his friend Robert ever having an adult daughter, but the hero knew for sure that Madame Eva had no children, because she died too early. Suddenly, the red-haired lady returned, as she urgently needed any help. It turned out that the search for the girl had almost reached a dead end, and the thief must definitely be caught. Pierre tried with all his might to convey to the lady that they could not wander around the estate like that. Cyril hadn't yet had time to come to his senses to chase after the unknown lady at such speed. But Muriel, for it was she, remained adamant in her desire to attract helpers. She reluctantly admitted that she was looking for the lost heir to the county of Nestria. Hearing this, Cyril froze in horror, as such a matter was a huge sensation. He did not remember any information about the Count's children, since he was not interested in his past. But if there was a kidnapper in the estate, it could have ended tragically for all its guests. For some reason, despite the importance of this matter, d'Abbeville was in no hurry to call adults for help. The girl spoke in riddles and did not even properly describe the thief's appearance to Pierre and Cyril. She assured that the boys would understand everything themselves as soon as they saw the very same kidnapper of the heir. The men had no choice but to believe the words of this strange stranger. Pierre was the first to collect his thoughts and set off in search of the child, who should be somewhere nearby. Only Cyril could not understand why no one present was worried about the kidnapping. Instead of mobilizing military forces, Muriel personally carried out the search. Only when the boy saw the kidnapper with his own eyes did he understand why the lady had not called the adults. The whole thing was that Chris Nestria, who was also an heiress, had dragged her little brother away. She resisted until the very end, as she did not want to return the child to the hands of her elders. Surprisingly, the little girl moved so quickly that she almost reached the exit with her brother in her arms. Only at the last moment did the young man realize that at this rate, he would not be able to catch the little rascal. But Pierre jumped out from around the corner in time, right in front of the lady as he was prepared for this meeting. Now Chris's desperate resistance had no effect on the knight's strong hands. No matter how much the Count's daughter screamed, no one would hear her in this corner of the estate. Muriel was very angry with the girl, who had already stolen her brother right from under the maids' noses more than once. But the little girl was used to such threats, so not a drop of conscience was reflected on her face. Cyril was given the important task of looking after the heir, and he felt the weight of this responsibility. Suddenly, the girl screamed loudly that she just wanted to take her little brother to their beloved mother. These words caused a heavy sigh from de Beauville, because she knew all the nuances of this family well. And not long ago, the Countess died, so the children were left under the care of nannies and their eternally busy father. This came as a surprise to Cyril, who remembered little about Count Nestria and his entire family. But Chris still denied the fact that her mother was no longer alive, even though she attended the funeral. In desperation, the little girl bit Pierre's hand with her teeth, hoping that he would loosen his grip. This action brought a positive result for the lady, so she was able to get out successfully. But Muriel didn't chase after the baby, because she understood how hard it was for her now. The girl chose her own way of grieving, and no one wanted to stop her from continuing to grieve over her mother's death. Gallienne had not previously heard the news that the Count's wife had died suddenly not long ago. De Beauville confirmed this, as she regretted that she had not managed to arrive with Eva before the funeral. Only Cyril, who was still holding the heir, was puzzled for a slightly different reason. The whole point was that in her past life, Madame cared about him, and not about Count Nestria's children. And this girl certainly did not help Eva in the performance of her duties, since Sebron saw her for the first time. The guy even felt a little ashamed that he was jealous of these little children. However, the hero could not get the thought out of his head about how his younger self was living now. After all, if Eva was here, it meant that the heir was alone in the empty imperial palace. As soon as the heir was returned, the nannies quickly and skillfully calmed the child, who had experienced stress. It turned out that de Beauville had fallen for Pierre, and so she asked him for help in searching for the baby around the estate. As a child, the girl often played with Alex and Gaston, so she missed these two people. But Gallienne himself still did not recognize the lady who had been communicating with him so boldly and confidently all this time. So the girl had to remind him of the time when the man came to her father's estate. Only now did the knight realize that the little red-haired girl had grown into a beautiful lady. It was difficult for him to accept this fact, because children often remained children to Gallio until the very end. The man didn't have time to give Muriel the answer she needed, as she herself heard a familiar voice in the corridor. At the sight of her old friend, de Beauville's face lit up, because they hadn't spoken for so long, although they were close. Alex was no less happy than the red-haired lady with whom fate had once again brought her together. Muriel's only complaint against Pierre was that he hadn't told her earlier about Arnaud's arrival. The knight himself felt ashamed that he did not recognize the young lady in this eccentric girl. Cyril watched the red-haired lady, whose name was well known to him, closely. He didn't expect that de Beauville would have such a strong and close relationship with Alex since childhood. It was clear from Muriel's face that you could trust her with any secret, and it would remain a secret. But in his past life, when the prince ascended the throne, this entire family had already been banished from the empire forever. It was for this reason that the influence of the Count of Corsica immediately increased among the ranks of the aristocrats. Before, Sebron hadn't thought about what kind of connections young Alex had in society, but now he saw that he was not the only one who had to lose many loved ones in a short period of time. All the people Lady Arnaud had once known had completely disappeared from her life by the time she grew up. Looking at the two girls in front of him, the guy remembered that he had completely forgotten about his original plan. After all, he was in this reality not for the sake of his past self, who suffered a lot. All of Cyril's actions were aimed only at protecting Alex, who could die in the future. Lady Arnaud had not forgotten that just recently her friend could hardly walk because of the fever that had gripped him. So she approached the young man with the desire to find out if everything was okay with him at the moment. But the hand that covered Cyril's forehead to check his temperature did not, in the end, belong to a lady. Pierre was the first to do this, because he didn't want the boy and girl to get even closer. Although Alex did not understand the knight's motives, she did not insist on her desire to personally check her friend's forehead. While they were talking, Muriel looked closely at the handsome foreigner, previously unknown to her. The guy vaguely reminded the girl of someone, but she couldn't remember who exactly. But de Beauville noticed that he was wearing exactly the same necklace around his neck as Alex. Muriel didn't know what to think about this yet, because she had too many questions in her head. Madame Eva, involuntarily, became interested in Cyril's personality at the very end of her conversation with Duke Arnaud's daughter. She was interested to know what kind of person this strange foreigner was, who was following the girl, but she didn't expect that it would turn out that this young man was found with memory loss somewhere deep in the forest. Ava was confused by the expression on Cyril's face the moment he met her for the first time in his life. Then, it seemed to the woman that the guy looked surprised, precisely because he recognized her well. Therefore, the madame had quite logical suspicions, although the young man did nothing bad to Alex. But his story haunted Eva, although she had too little information to draw any conclusions. As soon as Alex returned to the room, she told her friends about everything that had happened to her. But in reality, the girl couldn't come to terms with the fact that she would have to simply wait for events to develop. Tears came to Lady Arno's eyes just thinking about Gaston in the clutches of the enemy. The emotions inside the Duke's daughter were so strong that she was unable to contain them in front of her friends. The lady's greatest fear was that she would lose someone she knew from her childhood. Pierre understood his mistress's feelings perfectly, but agreed that they could not act on them. So Alex was left to continue to feel a sense of powerlessness that was contrary to her character. It was painful for Cyril to see his beloved in such a state, so he also wanted to console her. But Sabran's actions were stopped by something he couldn't even imagine in this reality. Gallion made it clear with one gesture that the guy had better not get close to the lady, taking advantage of this situation. Alex's tears were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door, which none of the three expected. It was quite late, so the girl couldn't even guess who had come. It turned out that Lady Arno had been given orders to move to another room for the night. The maid thought that this was something self-evident, since a lady could not sleep with guys. But morally, the Duke's daughter was already accustomed to being around friends, so any separation was perceived acutely by her. Alex had no objections to moving into her beloved Muriel's room, so she only said goodbye to Pierre tenderly, since she had no other choice. As they parted, Lady Arno said goodnight to Cyril, glad that he was feeling better. Both boys, with a slight degree of anxiety, saw off the Duke's daughter, who confidently walked straight down the corridor. Sabran didn't know how to communicate with Gallion after what had recently happened between them, but the man was the first to ask for forgiveness, melting the shards of ice that had begun to form in their hearts. Gallion hoped that the young man would be able to keep his feelings at the level of admiration, so as not to suffer. In fact, the hero understood perfectly well what was being discussed, but it was already too late for him. Even before his reincarnation, Cyril fell in love with Alex at first sight, and it was inevitable this time too. He knew well what suffering tasted like when you can only watch your beloved from the side. At this time, Alex felt some dissatisfaction with the fact that she was moved from room to room. Muriel was genuinely concerned that her friend's condition was good for everyone. Lady Arno was glad that they could spend the night together, but something still didn't sit well with her inside. D'Auboville was distracted by the compliments directed at her, so for a moment she forgot about her friend's thoughts. Then Alex asked how her friend ended up on these lands, which were far from her home, and Muriel said that she had come to Nestria, following Madame Eva, who had a lot to teach her. The girl was genuinely delighted that even just by observing Madame, she had already learned a lot. In her dreams, d'Auboville wanted to see Gaston in this place too, so that they could play the same way they used to in childhood. Alex felt sad at the mention of her brother, not knowing whether to tell the truth about him. Muriel had not been to Arno for so long that she knew nothing about how her friends from there were growing up. And this only made the Duke's daughter sadder, since there was no way to confess everything. She felt as if an invisible wall had arisen between her and her friend because of the secret she was keeping. The lady was worried that she might ruin good childhood memories with her words. But Muriel had already switched to another question, since Cyril had already caught her interest. D'Auboville was one of those who could not leave without the truth if something caught his attention to the depths of his soul. And the girl remembered well that the foreigner was wearing a necklace that had once been given to the Duke's daughter. It was Madame de Beauville who created such beauty from rare materials and sent it to the Duchess of Arnaud. Alex herself once suspected that the guy had her necklace because they were very similar. It took Lady Arno several hours to fully recount all the events, but the girls were in no hurry. Muriel was surprised by how much had happened in her friend's life in such a short time. Alex also shared that, during the trip, it was she who carried the young man on horseback so that he would not be overweight. At that moment, the girl was in such a hurry to get to Nestria that she forgot all the rules of etiquette. But in reality, Alex herself barely overcame the embarrassment of being so close to a good friend. Miss perceived Cyril as her brother, because that was the kind of relationship she built with all the guys. But when the young man boldly jumped into the river for her, something clicked in Alex's head, and it didn't give her any peace. Until now, the Duke's daughter did not understand why her feelings for Cyril had undergone incomprehensible changes. Muriel listened carefully to her friend before making any strong conclusions about the situation. She casually asked if Alex would feel awkward if Gaston were in Cyril's place. Daboville took one look at Miss to understand that there would be no awkwardness in Gaston's presence. This led the red-haired lady to the idea that her friend did not actually perceive the guy as a brother. Alex hadn't thought about this option before, because it was easier for her to think the same way as usual. But after Muriel's words, various images of Cyril began to pop up in the Duke's daughter's head. In such a short time, a lot of good things happened between them, which only strengthened their relationship. The fact that the young man was ready to save the lady in any situation greatly won over her attitude towards him. And only now did the girl realize that she had never felt exactly these emotions towards anyone else. Looking at the confident and fearless Cyril, she wanted to continue to be close to him. So Lady Arno confessed to her friend that the foreigner was a completely different person to her. But Alex had no idea what to do with her suddenly awakened love for the guy. To receive knighthood for the Duke's daughter, the entire company went to Nestria. Along the way, they accidentally learned that Gaston was involved in some bad business, about which he kept silent. And now the whole company had no idea if they could do anything to help Langdon's poor son. In fact, Cyril expected that the girl would easily achieve all her goals along the way. But it turned out that becoming a knight with the help of a count from another country was not so simple. Moreover, Alex fell into the hands of Eva, who could not allow her to walk around without a dress. This order came as a surprise to the lady, who was not used to dressing up even when visiting. But the woman could not allow the girl to behave in a manner that was not in accordance with etiquette. She smiled and allowed Alex to put on one of her dresses, which were already quite small. But such kindness did not ease the girl's condition, which was already upset. Only now did she realize that she had left one strict teacher to go to another. Pierre suggested that Eva was so cruel because of her involvement in the affairs of the imperial family. But Cyril knew for sure that the woman's character was initially so harsh. The boy still remembered his fear during his training with Madame when he was little. But as soon as the young man met Alex's gaze, he immediately blossomed into a sweet smile. The girl didn't expect this from her friend, as she was now watching him more closely. She couldn't get the declaration of love for Cyril, which she told her friend yesterday, out of her head. So now Lady Arno blushed next to the foreigner, even if there was no reason for it. From the moment Miss accepted her feelings, Cyril constantly seemed sweet to her. The Duke's daughter could no longer remain calm in the company of her friends, as her thoughts disturbed her, so she ran away under the pretext that she was ordered to change into a dress. The hero did not understand the girl's behavior, because he could not imagine that she loved him. So the guy felt like he had a broken compass that couldn't show him the way. That evening, all the guests at the estate had a common dinner with the owners of this place. But Cyril was only anxiously awaiting the arrival of Alex, who for some reason was late for dinner. As Eva passed by the young man, she couldn't help but notice his good table manners. The woman concluded out loud that the guy had probably been specially trained in this skill. The hero did not say that it was the madam who instilled in him the rules of behavior in childhood. But this comment served as confirmation for Gallio of his thoughts that Cyril was rich. Only the guy noticed that Eva was now teaching the Count's children everything. And young Lady Chris did not try at all to behave properly at the table, as the aristocrat believed. Of course, the woman couldn't help but reprimand the little girl so that she would correct her behavior. But the girl reacted extremely strongly, because she didn't need another mother to replace the one who had died. Because of this situation, Chris ran away from the table early, without even saying goodbye to anyone. The hero was outraged by the lady's behavior, because he considered Eva a deservedly worthy person. But then the guy's attention was distracted by Pierre, who suddenly stood up from his seat for some reason. Cyril watched him go with an uncomprehending look, since they didn't have to go anywhere. Only a moment later did the young man realize who exactly the polite knight was heading towards. An incredibly beautiful Alex, wearing a dress for the first time in a long time, came down to dinner. The girl sparkled both outside and inside, perfectly understanding her grace and delicacy. The knight rose from the table, only to show all his respect to his lady. He volunteered to personally escort the Duke's daughter and seat her on a chair in order to observe all the rules of etiquette. The hero had no choice but to watch in confusion at Pierre, whose place he wanted to take. Suddenly, Cyril remembered the past, in which he also silently watched Alex. Every time this situation occurred, the lady found herself on the other side of her friend, and he only looked at the daughter of Duke Arno, unable to come even a centimeter closer. Sebran believed that since there was no longer an age difference between them, he had a chance. But for some reason, the feeling that the girl was on the other side never disappeared between them. Only a few minutes later, did the lady notice that Cyril was not at the table for some reason. She approached Muriel about this, and the lady also remembered the guy's presence. But in the end, the young man disappeared so quietly that no one saw when and where he went. And the Duke's daughter was left wondering in her mind why her friend had run away so soon. The hero ran away only because he could no longer control the emotions on his face. But he didn't want to ruin such a wonderful evening with his sour expression. Although everything seemed to be fine, the guy felt envy and jealousy towards Alex. He wanted to be next to her, to be in Pierre's place. But all this was impossible. That is why Cyril chose a small escape as the best solution for himself. Suddenly, Sebran heard a pleasant voice humming a lullaby in the darkness. The young man was confused, because he thought that there would be no one near him in this huge estate. But it turned out that little Chris, with a candle in her hands, was fearlessly walking down the empty corridor. The girl was heading to the place where her mother, who had recently died of illness, was buried. In fact, Chris was very afraid of the dark, so she was scared of every little thing in the estate. However, the lady did not stop on her way, because she really wanted to visit her mother. Cyril carefully followed the girl, who so stubbornly followed her path. He noticed how Chris was constantly shaking with fear, but still walked forward without stopping. Only now did the guy realize how stupid he had been to feel jealous of this lady. Every time he forgot that he didn't have to take care of his little self, who lived in the palace. Just in case, the young man remained near the crypt to make sure nothing happened to the baby. The likelihood that anyone else would come to the tomb so late was very small. But still, Cyril couldn't leave Chris completely alone in the middle of the dark estate. Almost immediately, he heard the sounds of quiet crying coming from inside the crypt. Although the young man knew the reasons for the little girl's grief, he still felt uneasy because of her tears. But Chris had no other option to be sad, so she dealt with it this way. Only Cyril, who was also left alone, could understand the full weight of the young lady's sorrow. And that's why the guy didn't interfere with her condition, understanding that she needed to experience it herself. Only after a few minutes did the crying inside the crypt die down, along with the incoherent muttering. But no matter how much the hero peered into the darkness of the tomb, the lady did not return from it. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear the steps behind him, but Eva was approaching him. The woman knew very well about the antics of young Chris and tried not to leave her alone. None of them expected to meet each other in the corridor because of the little heiress. Eva still had many questions for the foreigner, but now was not the time to ask them. Soon the girl was taken away by a maid, who delicately ignored Chris's tear-stained face. The baby fell silent only because she fell asleep from fatigue and a huge number of worries. Eva immediately guessed that Cyril stayed next to Chris to make sure nothing happened to her. Sebran was pleased to receive gratitude from the man he had feared throughout his childhood. But it was not Eva who taught him this kindness, although she contributed a lot to the prince's character. The young man inherited all his good character traits from Alex, who always supported him. The girl's smile said that the prince was no longer alone, so he did not need to suffer. Suddenly, Madame shared rumors that she was going to take the place of the deceased countess. Cyril had no idea that anyone could think like that, because nothing like that had happened in the past. He knew nothing about whether Eva really had a relationship with the strict Count of Nestria. But in fact, the lady simply laughed at the guy, whose emotions were easy to read. But the jokes ended the moment the woman looked closely at Cyril's face. She was already acquainted with the young heir, so she could not help but notice their similarities. Eva explained this to herself by the fact that both boys were from Castile and could be related. But the hero still felt uneasy, because this attentive lady suspected him. He had forgotten how well the woman studied and remembered all the people she met. Although Eva wouldn't have been able to tell that Cyril had traveled through time, he should have been more careful. Suddenly, Madame started talking again about the heir, who lost his father and mother early. She admitted that she tried to get closer to the prince, but he was terribly afraid of her. That is why Eva decided to leave for Nestria, and Bianca took her place in the palace. The hero felt calmer when he realized that little Cyril was not alone. Suddenly, the young man was flooded with images he had never seen before. He was able to spy on the situation when Alex's mother had just arrived at the imperial palace. The woman admitted that she could not bear the fact that her daughter was under threat. That is why she decided to get closer to the prince, whose influence would be great in the future. After all, Bianca was no longer going to approve of the marriage with Count Corsica, which Alex was threatening. In order to prevent the wedding, the Duchess had to remain in the capital for some time. And the fact that she could look after young Cyril was only to the woman's advantage. An unspoken agreement arose between the two friends about who would take which place. In fact, Eva herself was drawn in spirit to Nestria, where the Countess had recently died. But duty and obligations restrained Madame, who always tried to act honorably. Now the Empress was ill, and the question of her death was getting closer day by day. So Eva felt that it was her responsibility to look after the young heir to the throne. That was why she could not give up her place to Bianca, no matter what benefit it would bring her. However, the Duchess quickly managed to find suitable arguments for her friend. Over the years, Eva had forgotten that she was not obliged to serve only House Sabran, and Bianca reminded the woman that she should be where her heart was pulling her with all its might. The closest clan to Eva was Nestria, into which she herself was born and raised as a child. So Madame would like to help the deceased Countess by educating her children well. And only now, after Bianca's words, Eva realized how wrong she had been all this time. The Duchess was right when she said that the Emperor depends on the well-being of his lands. Therefore, every aristocrat had to take her place and educate the necessary children. All night after this situation, Cyril could not sleep, because he finally understood Eva's thoughts. He went out into the fresh air to think again about what he had accidentally seen. The boy had no idea that inside of her, Madame was suppressing her love for Nestria and her heirs. The hero was sad because he could not see the future and the present at will. If Sabran had been able to control this gift, many mistakes could have been avoided. At the very moment of these thoughts, he noticed a tall human figure in a cloak below. The boy could never fail to recognize that pale face with the cold eyes on it. Each time, Cyril chased after the magician, but he always eluded him from talking. And now this man personally called the heir to show him the right path. At this time, Alex also could not fall asleep because of the thoughts that did not give her peace. The girl was finally convinced that she loved Cyril and didn't know what to do about it. The lady was most offended by the suspicion that the guy was deliberately avoiding her at dinner. She was not ready to admit this fact because she did not see any prerequisites for such behavior. But the girl's brain told her that there really was some kind of distance between them all the time. Since it was impossible for Lady Arno to fall asleep, she went out for a walk. The girl often did this in those moments when she needed to think before going to bed. And now, all of Alex's thoughts were captured by yesterday's conversation with Muriel about love for Cyril. Then d'Auboville said seriously that they should draw a strict line in their relationship. The red-haired lady had no doubt that the foreigner also had feelings for the miss, but Alex herself rejected this option, since she had never seen any hints from her friend. From the very beginning, Cyril's position was precarious in a foreign country where no one knew him, and Lady Arno thought that he helped her only because he considered her his noble savior. Mariel could clearly see all the doubts on her friend's face, and she felt sincerely sorry for her. But the girl couldn't help but remind that Alex was the only heir of her family. So in the future, the parents will choose a groom for the lady who will suit her status. D'Auboville had already gotten used to the idea that she wasn't allowed to look at other guys. But Arno couldn't accept the fact that she and Cyril would not be allowed to be together anyway. Until now, this thought has caused pain to the girl who fell madly in love with her friend. Then she suddenly heard fast running along the corridor, which was strange at such a time. A small figure passed right in front of the lady and did not even notice her, as he was in a hurry. Alex immediately recognized Cyril, who quickly ran away, as if someone was running after him. The lady could not even imagine why her friend had run away from the estate so late at night. The thing was that the young man was very afraid that the magician would leave again and leave him with questions. That is why he ran so fast, not at all sparing his body, tired from the day. And this time, the hero was unable to easily reach the magician, who began to weave between buildings. His face was expressionless, as if the man had been dead for a long time. But even so, Cyril could not stop, because only the magician knew something about his abilities. Sabran's only fear was that the stranger was simply playing with his feelings for fun. However, the man had never let the young man down before, always warning him of danger. Cyril approached the man in the cloak with caution when he stopped running away from him. It was clear that the magician did not want to cause any harm to the guy he himself invited to talk. But his actions were still sharp and confident, so he quickly approached Cyril. One glance at the guy was enough for the magician to understand that he could not yet use his eyes. The hero had no idea that he could see any time and event he wanted. The magician promised that if the boy cast aside all his fears and doubts, He would learn to use his eyes. Previously, Cyril had no idea that he was a sorcerer, just like his unknown assistant. The man said that they were both chosen by God to carry out his will on earth. Their task was to build the future that the great heavenly ruler wanted to see. The powers of an adult sorcerer were limited, which is why he rarely appeared to help. That is why Cyril had to single-handedly stop Alex's death, which God did not want. In a panic, the young man clung to the magician because he had no idea how he could avoid such a future. But at the most crucial moment, something suddenly pulled Cyril out of the blue, and he seemed to find himself in a different place. The guy couldn't believe his eyes when he saw a breathless Alex in front of him instead of the magician. The girl looked warily at her friend, who had just not answered her questions. Cyril didn't expect the lady to find him all alone in the middle of this empty street. He was absolutely certain that he was communicating with a sorcerer, but others apparently could not see him. It was only after a few minutes that Sabran realized that he was still holding the lady's shoulders in his hands. He immediately jumped aside, since such behavior was not tolerated among friends. Both the boy and the girl were embarrassed by this accident that brought them closer together. But Alex had so many questions in her head that she couldn't remain silent for too long. In fact, Cyril had no intention of running away because he needed to talk to the magician. However, he saw the lady's worries, who decided that the young man had changed his plans. So the hero quickly lied that he simply went out to get some air because of insomnia. This made Lady Arno feel a little calmer, because it turned out that the young man also could not sleep. In fact, she was worried that the guy might run away alone in the middle of the night. The girl began to fear that the memories would return to Cyril and he would go home. Alex understood perfectly well how meanly she thought when she wanted to keep her beloved. She was so deep in thought that she didn't notice how Cyril suddenly froze in the middle of the street. The lady's displeasure knew no bounds, although it was her own fault that she had been hit. But as soon as Miss noticed the man who was passing in front of them, she forgot about everything. She froze in horror, as that scarred face was unmistakable. It was this man that Gaston was accompanying when they met by chance in the village. So there was a high probability that the guy was now somewhere in Nestria.